The desert awakens. The desert was not silent, though it seemed still from afar. Its stillness was only the patience of something ancient, something that had seen gods rise and fade, empires bloom and crumble, their dust folded again into its endless dunes. Beneath the low twilight, the sand rippled in delicate shivers, whispering to itself in tones that were older than words. The horizon burned faintly with the last embers of the setting sun, and over it hung the evening star, trembling above the line of the Theban cliffs. You could almost imagine that the air itself held its breath, waiting, remembering. Somewhere beneath those ochre hills, far beyond the reach of the present, the bones of pharaohs rested beside their servants, and the spirits of queens still drifted through corridors of stone, brushing against the memories of the living like sighs against fabric. A wind gathered, not a harsh one, but a slow, deliberate current that wound between dunes and hollows, as though tracing a forgotten path. It carried with it the scent of dry earth, the bitterness of the desert night. The sand lifted and shimmered in veils, moving like ghosts across the ground, covering and uncovering fragments of stone, half-buried carvings, the occasional glint of something metallic, a buckle, a fragment of an amulet, something once worn by hands that had long since turned to dust. The wind seemed to know where it was going. It climbed the slope of a small hill, curved around a boulder, and slipped into a hollow where the air felt strangely cool. There, beneath the surface, something old stirred not with motion, but with awareness. A faint hum, the vibration of stone meeting stone, like the resonance of a string stretched across centuries, rose from beneath the sand. Then it faded again, leaving behind only the sound of the wind, whispering secrets to itself. Night came in swiftly, like the closing of an unseen hand. The moon rose, large and pale, washing the land in silver and shadow. Every dune became a wave frozen mid-crest, every rock a sentinel, every breath of air a murmur from the past. It was the kind of night that made the mind wander backward, toward the old world, to the time when priests walked with measured grace through incense smoke, when chants echoed through temples lined with pillars, and when each grain of sand was thought to hold a fragment of a god's memory. Somewhere out there, hidden under countless layers of time, lay one such fragment, waiting. It had waited through the fall of empires, through the silence of centuries, through the footsteps of explorers who passed too far to hear its call. It waited for someone who would listen, someone who might awaken it, not through greed or glory, but through an accident of destiny. Far in the distance, the faint orange glow of lanterns flickered. A small caravan was making its way across the dunes, each step deliberate, each beast's breath visible in the cooling air. The camels groaned softly, their shadows stretching long and thin under the moon. At the head of the group rode a man with a hat wide enough to shield him from the day's merciless light. His face, though young, carried the weariness of one who had spent too long chasing whispers. His name was Dr. Alistair Wynne, and though his journals would one day become legend among Egyptologists, tonight he was only a man following a rumour through the desert, a rumour of a tomb that spoke. He had first heard it months ago, in Cairo, over the coarse crackle of a phonograph and the drone of ceiling fans in the British Institute. Someone had mentioned an unmarked valley beyond Thebes, where shepherds avoided grazing their flocks because of a sound that rose from the earth at night, a faint voice, sometimes singing, sometimes whispering a name that none could quite recall. The locals believed it to be the breath of a spirit condemned never to rest. To Alistair, however, it was something else, the echo of a truth buried under centuries of superstition. And though his colleagues laughed and warned him against pursuing peasant fables, he could not resist the pull of mystery. For every man of science, there comes a moment when reason bends before wonder, and for Alistair, this was that moment. As the caravan reached the edge of a limestone ridge, the guide raised his hand, signalling a halt. The wind had changed direction. It blew now from the east, carrying a sound that seemed almost like a sigh. The men grew uneasy, muttering in Arabic that the desert was restless tonight. Alistair dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat, and turned his eyes toward the horizon. Before him stretched the Valley of the Kings, a landscape carved by both nature and ambition, where tombs tunneled deep into the earth like veins into the heart of eternity. Yet the place they sought was not among the known tombs, nor on any map. It lay somewhere beyond, in a minor wadi, where the cliffs were steep, and the air carried a peculiar stillness, as if sound itself had forgotten how to travel there. They made camp beneath the ridge, the camels kneeling in a circle as the men lit small fires of palm wood. Sparks rose, fluttered briefly, and vanished into the dark. Alistair sat apart, his notebook resting on his knee. The flame light flickered across his face, revealing the faint trace of excitement behind his calm expression. He wrote a few lines. The air hums with anticipation. I cannot shake the feeling that something beneath us stirs, as if the sand itself remembers. Then he paused, lifted his gaze to the moon, and smiled faintly. The hum of the desert was steady now, a low vibration that blended almost imperceptibly with the wind. It could have been the sound of air moving through rock hollows or something older. In the distance, a lone jackal cried. The men around the fire exchanged glances, muttering prayers to ward off the spirits of the west. Alistair listened, not with fear but fascination. To the Egyptians, the jackal had been the herald of Anubis, the guardian of tombs, the one who guided souls through the passage between life and death. Its cry tonight seemed like an omen, but of what? He could not yet tell. The stars shimmered above, scattered like fragments of broken glass across the velvet of the heavens. Somewhere between them, invisible yet eternal, the gods of old watched in silence. As the night deepened, Alistair lay awake, unable to rest. He could hear the wind brushing the tent fabric, the slow breathing of the camels, the faint crackle of the dying fire. But beneath it all, so faint that it could easily have been imagination, came another sound. A murmur, distant and rhythmic, like someone reciting a name underwater. He held his breath, straining to catch it again. For a moment, it stopped. Then, faintly, it returned, a syllable repeated again and again, soft as silk, ancient as sand. He rose quietly, stepping out into the open air. The desert stretched before him, luminous under the moon. The wind had died completely, yet the murmur persisted. He walked a few paces away from the camp, feeling the cool sand shift beneath his boots. Each step brought the sound clearer, though not louder, as if it existed not in the air but in his own mind. It came from beneath his feet, from deep within the earth. He knelt, pressing his palm to the sand. The vibration was faint, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably real. He whispered into the night, "Who are you?" And for an instant so brief, he could never later decide whether it truly happened. The murmur seemed to answer. A gust of wind rose suddenly, swirling around him and scattering grains of sand like glittering dust. The murmur ceased. He stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, before turning back toward the camp. The fires were low now, the men asleep. The desert had reclaimed its stillness. But as Alistair returned to his tent, a strange certainty settled in his chest. The sands were not empty. They were listening. They were waiting. When he finally drifted to sleep, the dream came swiftly vivid, golden, and filled with music that shimmered like light through water. He stood in a vast hall lined with columns, each carved with symbols that moved like living things. At the far end stood a figure draped in linen and gold, her face hidden by a veil, her voice low and melodic. She whispered a name, and though he could not remember it upon waking, he felt it linger on his tongue like the taste of honey. When the sun rose over the desert the next morning, its first light spilling over the dunes, Alistair awoke with a start. The dream was gone, but its echo remained, a pull, a direction. He stepped outside into the brilliant glare of dawn and turned toward the ridge. Somewhere beyond it, the sands held their secret. He did not yet know it, but the desert had already chosen him. The scholar's arrival. The sun over Thebes rose with a blinding ferocity, its light spilling down the cliffs like molten gold, washing over the scattered tents, the river beyond, and the crumbling ruins that had long since surrendered their glory to the dust. To the untrained eye, this corner of Egypt looked like any other, a barren expanse where rock met sky in endless argument. Yet for Dr. Alistair Wynne, it was the threshold between history and myth. As he stood on the deck of the small boat ferrying him across the Nile, he watched the sun shimmer on the surface of the water and thought of the countless generations who had crossed here before him, pharaohs borne on gilded barges, priests carrying offerings to temples that now lay in ruin, soldiers who once marched under banners, now swallowed by sand. He wondered if they, too, had felt the same quiet thrill, the same trembling sense that the desert was not a grave but a memory that never forgot. Behind him, the oarsman hummed an old Nubian tune, its melody drifting lazily across the water. It was a simple, unhurried sound, one that seemed to know the rhythm of the river itself. Alistair closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm his face. He had travelled for months to reach this place, from London's fog-choked streets to Alexandria's sunlit chaos, then up the Nile aboard a narrow steamer that smelled of rust and jasmine. Each mile had carried him deeper, not only into Egypt's heart, but into a state of feverish anticipation. He had read the stories of Howard Carter's discovery in the Valley of the Kings, of treasures that gleamed like firelight, of tombs untouched by modern hands. But Alistair was not chasing gold. What drew him was something far more elusive, the truth hidden beneath myth, the human breath behind the hieroglyph. He had studied Egyptology at Oxford under the venerable Sir Malcolm Havers, who taught that every tomb was a dialogue not between the living and the dead, but between time and eternity. To excavate, Havers had once said, is to listen. The stones will speak, if you are patient enough. Alistair remembered those words now as he stepped off the boat, his boots crunching into the sand of the western bank. The air was hot already, shimmering with the promise of noon, and the scent of dust and sunburned rock filled his lungs. He looked up at the cliffs that rose beyond the valley, their surfaces streaked with shadows. Somewhere behind them, he knew, lay the tomb that had haunted his thoughts for months, the one said to belong to the Queen who whispers. A small caravan awaited him, camels, supplies, and a handful of workers from Luxor hired through the antiquities office. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes named Hamid, greeted him with a nod that carried both respect and reservation. "Dr. Wynne," he said in careful English, "you will find the valley quiet, too quiet perhaps, but quiet does not mean empty." There was a weight to his tone that Alistair noted but did not comment on. He had learned that in Egypt, warnings often came wrapped in poetry. They set out at once, following the path that wound through the broken hills. The heat pressed down like a hand upon the back of the neck. The air shimmered, distorting the horizon so that the cliffs seemed to float like islands. Every so often, Alistair would dismount to inspect a scatter of pottery shards or a fragment of carved limestone, brushing the dust from its surface with the tenderness of a man greeting an old friend. The locals watched him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, whispering among themselves. To them, the desert was alive, a place of spirits and voices, not merely of history. When the wind blew, it was the breath of the gods. When it stilled, silence itself was sacred. By late afternoon, they reached the outskirts of a small village nestled in a shallow wadi, its mud-brick walls blending almost invisibly into the surrounding rock. A few goats bleated lazily in the heat. Children paused in their games to stare at the strangers with wide eyes. Hamid spoke briefly to an elder who emerged from one of the huts, his skin weathered like old papyrus. The conversation was hushed but intense. After a few minutes, the old man turned to Alistair, his gaze sharp despite his years. "You come looking for the sleeping one," he said in Arabic, which Hamid translated softly. "You think she is treasure, but treasure does not whisper. It only waits." Alistair inclined his head respectfully. "I come for knowledge," he replied. "If there is a tomb, I would see it, and if there is a spirit, I will honor it." The old man studied him for a long moment, then pointed toward the horizon where the cliffs curved into shadow. "Beyond the 3 stones," he said, "where the wind forgets to blow, that is where she dreams. Many have gone, none have found her. But if you hear her name, do not speak it. Promise me that." Alistair hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." That night they camped on the edge of the wadi. The villagers refused to join them, retreating to their homes before dusk with a strange haste. The air grew cool, and the first stars appeared, sharp and close, as if one could reach up and brush them with a hand. Alistair sat near the fire, writing by the dim light of a lantern. His notes were calm, methodical. Arrived at Theban outskirts. Locals aware of legend. Possible site westward. signs of late 18th dynasty artifacts, geological anomalies in cliff formations worth surveying. Yet even as he wrote, he felt an undercurrent of unease. The old man's words lingered. Treasure does not whisper. When the fire had burned low, Alistair rose and walked to the edge of camp. The night stretched vast before him, silver and still. He could see the outline of the 3 stones the elder had mentioned, jagged monoliths, standing in a rough triangle at the mouth of a ravine. Beyond them, the darkness thickened like velvet. The wind, which had been constant all evening, seemed to die as he approached, leaving the air unnaturally still. He took 1 step past the stones, then another, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows across the sand. And then a sound. Not a whisper this time, but a faint, low note, as if the earth itself exhaled. It rose from the ground, steady and resonant, like the humming of a distant choir. Alistair froze. His pulse quickened, though he could not have said why. The sound was not threatening. It was mournful, almost beautiful. He knelt, holding the lantern low, and saw that the sand beneath his feet had begun to shift ever so slightly, as if stirred by some breath from below. He reached out with his fingers, brushing away the surface. The texture changed. Beneath the fine sand was something smooth, not stone, but worked surface. He cleared a little more, revealing the edge of a carved block. Its corners were sharp, unweathered, as though time itself had hesitated to touch it. He could make out faint hieroglyphs, the Eye of Ra, a coiled serpent, the Ankh, and below them a name partially obscured, its symbols strange, unrecorded in any catalogue he knew. He leaned closer, his lips moving as he traced the glyphs with a trembling hand. Neferet. The final symbol had been erased, chiselled away in antiquity. He frowned. Neferet, he murmured, uncertain. At that very instant, a gust of wind swept through the ravine, extinguishing his lantern. The darkness fell like a curtain, absolute and suffocating. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of his own breathing, and then, faintly, unmistakably, a whisper brushed his ear. Yes. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. The whisper faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving only silence. When he relit his lantern, the sand was still again, unmarked except for his footprints. The block lay half-buried, innocent, mute. Perhaps it had been imagination, the desert playing tricks on a weary mind. Yet as he returned to camp, one thought echoed in him with unsettling certainty. The old man's warning had not been superstition. It had been memory. By dawn, the decision was made. He would excavate the site at once. His journal entry for that day was brief, almost terse. Possible pre-New Kingdom tomb discovered west of Thebes. Preliminary markings suggest the presence of a forgotten queen. Strange phenomena noted auditory illusions, air vibrations, local apprehension. Further investigation required. The men were uneasy, muttering prayers as they prepared the tools. But Alistair was calm, or appeared to be. Beneath his composed demeanour burned the quiet flame of obsession. He could not have known that by disturbing that single buried stone, he had awakened not just a tomb, but a story the desert itself had tried to forget. And so, beneath the unrelenting sun, the sand began to move once more, not by wind, but by will. The scholar had arrived, and the past was listening. The local legend. Morning came with the shimmer of heat already rising from the sands, as if the desert wished to warn the intruders before the day had even begun. The sky was mercilessly clear, a blue so vast it seemed to hum, and the cliffs threw back the light in waves that made men squint and sweat before the first hour had passed. But Alistair Wynne was oblivious to discomfort. He stood beside the newly uncovered stone slab, notebook in hand, his eyes bright with the fervour of discovery. The villagers' warnings echoed faintly in his memory, but they felt distant now, like echoes from a dream that could no longer command fear. He was, after all, a man of science, trained to measure, to catalogue, to doubt. And yet, beneath the rational discipline of his mind, something less tangible stirred a feeling that the sand beneath his boots was not merely ground, but the skin of a sleeping giant, breathing softly beneath him. The workers laboured in silence, their shovels biting into the sand with a steady rhythm. Occasionally, One would pause, wipe his brow, and glance toward the horizon where the 3 stones stood, their shadows long and sharp. Hamid, overseeing the men, spoke little. His face was drawn, his eyes fixed often on the ground, as though afraid to look directly at what they unearthed. He had heard the tales since childhood, the ones that mothers whispered to keep their children from wandering too far after dark. Every village along the Nile had its legends of spirits bound to stones, of queens who bargained with gods, of voices that called the living to their doom. But this one was older, more secret. Few spoke of it openly, and even fewer remembered its details. It was said that the sands themselves punished those who dared to tell the story too loudly. When the sun reached its zenith, Alistair called for a rest. The men withdrew to the shade of a canvas awning, murmuring softly among themselves. He approached Hamid, who sat apart, turning a small amulet in his hands, a scarab of greenish stone strung on a frayed cord. "Tell me," Alistair said, seating himself beside him, "what do they call this place?" Hamid hesitated, eyes fixed on the scarab. "We call it Wadi el Maut el Samit," he said finally. "The Valley of the Silent Death." Alistair smiled faintly. "A grim name." "It was not always so," Hamid replied. "Long ago, before the Arabs came, before even the Copts, this valley had another name. The elders say it was Per Neferet, the House of Neferet." The word struck Alistair like a chord. He straightened. "Neferet? You're certain?" Hamid nodded slowly. "It is what is said. She was a priestess, they say. Or perhaps a queen no one remembers clearly. Some claim she was the daughter of a pharaoh, born beneath an unlucky star. Others say she was the bride of a god who spoke words forbidden to mortal ears. When she died, or was killed, the stories differ. Her name was erased from every wall, her statues broken, her face chipped away so that her soul could never find peace. But still, she spoke. Even as her tomb was sealed, her voice was heard. The sand remembers her whispers. Alistair listened in silence, his pulse quickening. The legend had the ring of myth, but myths, he knew, were often the residue of history truths disguised by centuries of retelling. "And the villagers?" he asked. "They believe the voice still speaks?" Hamid's eyes flicked toward the excavation pit. "Not believe," he said softly. "They know. When the wind dies, you can hear her. She calls to travelers. Sometimes she says her name, sometimes the name of the one who listens. Those who answer never return." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint rattle of sand against canvas, like the hiss of dry breath. Alistair looked out across the dunes. The light shimmered so fiercely that the horizon seemed to melt into the sky. He tried to imagine the woman at the heart of this legend, a priestess erased from time, condemned to whisper through the ages. What had she done to earn such wrath? What secret had she spoken that the gods themselves had silenced her name? The thought filled him not with fear, but with awe. If she had been real and the evidence beneath his feet suggested as much, then she might be the missing link between myth and memory, the embodiment of Egypt's forgotten voice. That night, after the men had eaten and retired to their tents, Alistair sat alone by the fire, his notebook open on his lap. The desert stretched around him, vast and indifferent. He wrote by the wavering light of the flame. Hamid recounts local legend of Neferet, a priestess or queen whose name was erased. Suggests damnatio memoriae, a deliberate obliteration from the royal record. Intriguing, the phenomenon of auditory hallucination, whispering, may derive from subterranean air currents within tomb structure. To investigate further, he paused, tapping the pen against his chin. There was, of course, the rational explanation: sound, travelling through fissures, echoing in strange ways, amplified by temperature changes. He had encountered such phenomena before. Yet this felt different. The whisper he had heard last night had not been the voice of wind or stone. It had been aware. He looked up. The fire had burned low, and the air was still. In the distance, a faint shimmer marked the outline of the 3 stones. Between them, the darkness seemed thicker than elsewhere, as though something within it drank the starlight. Alistair found his gaze drawn to that spot again and again, until at last he rose and walked toward it, guided by curiosity that bordered on compulsion. The sand was cool beneath his boots. Each step sank with a soft sigh, releasing the scent of minerals and ancient dust. He stopped at the edge of the stones and waited, listening. The desert held its breath. Then, faintly like the first note of a forgotten melody, came the whisper. It was the same voice as before, gentle and low, but now clearer, closer. It did not speak words at first. It was merely sound, like the murmur of silk against stone. But then the syllables formed, unmistakable. Neferet. He closed his eyes. Neferet, he whispered back. The air shifted. A faint current brushed his cheek, neither warm nor cold. And then another voice joined it, not spoken aloud, but resonating within his thoughts. You hear me. His eyes flew open. The desert was empty, yet the presence lingered, wrapping around him like unseen fabric. His rational mind rebelled. Hallucination, he told himself. Fatigue, suggestion born of expectation. But another part of him, deeper, older, felt no fear, only recognition, as though he had waited his whole life to hear that voice. He returned to camp before dawn, pale and silent. Hamid, rising early for prayer, saw him and frowned. You walked near the stones, he said quietly. You should not. I heard her, Alistair murmured, almost absently. The name, clear as you hear me now. Hamid's expression darkened. Then you are bound, he said. Once she speaks to you, she remembers you. You cannot leave until she is answered. Alistair tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. I intend to answer her with archaeology, not prayers. But when he lay down again, sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shimmer of linen, the glint of gold, the curve of hieroglyphs dancing like fire, and beneath it all, the voice whispering softly, patiently, "Remember me." The following days passed in a blur of work and wonder. The excavation expanded quickly. More blocks emerged, forming what was clearly the sealed entrance to a tomb. The carvings were exquisite, delicate lines of lotus and falcon, sun discs and serpents, symbols of power and resurrection. But the most striking feature was what was missing. Wherever the cartouches should have borne a royal name, they had been chiseled out, leaving only blank ovals like empty eyes. Someone, long ago, had sought to erase not just a woman's memory, but her existence. At night, Alistair pored over every detail, sketching the fragments by lantern light. He compared the stylistic elements to known dynasties, but found no perfect match. The work suggested late 18th or early 19th dynasty, the turbulent period after Akhenaten, when heresy and restoration had rewritten history. Could Neferet have lived then, caught in the tide of religious reform and vengeance? Perhaps she had been a priestess of Aten, or a rival to a queen. The possibilities danced in his mind like sparks. Yet as the physical tomb emerged, so too did the unease among the men. Strange sounds echoed from the pit, not the normal groan of shifting rock, but rhythmic murmurs that seemed to pulse like breath. Once, a lantern shattered for no reason. Another time, a worker screamed that something had brushed his shoulder, though no one was near. Two men refused to return the next morning, claiming they had heard a woman crying under the earth. Hamid said little, but his expression grew heavier each day. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson, he approached Alistair. "Doctor," he said, "when a name is erased, it is not by accident. It is because the gods themselves have forbidden remembrance. To dig here is to break their will." Alistair met his gaze steadily. Or to fulfill it, perhaps the gods wish her story to be told at last. Hamid said nothing more, but when he turned away, he whispered a prayer under his breath. As darkness fell, Alistair looked once more toward the ravine. The stars glimmered like eyes, the wind carried the faintest sigh, and in that sigh he thought he heard laughter soft, sorrowful, ancient. The legend was no longer merely a tale told by frightened villagers. It was unfolding around him, breathing through him. The queen who whispers had found her listener. Echoes beneath the sand. The days that followed unfolded in a haze of sunlight and exhaustion, as though the entire valley had fallen into a trance. Each morning the horizon shimmered, pale and uncertain, and each night the stars burned with an intensity that made them seem closer than the very air. The excavation site had taken shape ropes, ladders, and tents, scattered like the beginnings of a small city against the desolate backdrop of Theban cliffs. Yet beneath all the industry, beneath the measured scraping of trowels and the scratch of brushes on ancient stone, there lingered a subtle rhythm, an undercurrent of something living, murmuring just beneath the surface. Alistair Wynne felt it even when he tried not to. There were moments, as he crouched beside a slab or examined a fragment of painted plaster, when he sensed the faintest tremor through his fingertips, like a pulse beneath the rock. At first he told himself it was the desert wind, the constant shifting of sand over stone, but the feeling persisted, even when the air was utterly still. It seemed to come and go with his breath, as though the tomb itself exhaled when he did. By the 5th day of excavation, they had exposed the full outline of the entrance. The doorway was recessed into the cliffside, framed by 2 columns carved in relief with lotus motifs, their colour miraculously preserved under the centuries of sand. Between them ran a band of hieroglyphs so finely incised that they seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Alistair brushed them carefully, whispering each symbol under his breath. The text, though damaged, was clear enough to translate in part. It was not a dedication, as one might expect, but a warning. To those who disturb the house of silence, remember what was spoken and broken. The voice that defied the gods will not rest until her name is freed, or the trespasser joins her in remembrance. Tend. He traced the final glyph, a stylized feather, the emblem of Ma'at, the divine balance, and frowned. Such curses were not uncommon, yet the tone here was strange, not vengeance, but sorrow. The writer had not wished to punish intruders, but to compel them to understand. It was, he thought, less a curse than a plea. The workers muttered prayers as he copied the inscription into his notebook. Hamid approached, his face tight. "Doctor," he said softly, "I do not like this. The men say they hear her voice at night. Yesterday, one said she called his name." Alistair looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The mind is suggestible, Hamid. When one believes he will hear a ghost, he finds her easily enough in the wind." "Perhaps," Hamid said, "but what if the wind listens too?" The words hung between them, fragile and uneasy. Alistair turned back to his work, unwilling to answer. There was truth in Hamid's caution, perhaps, but he could not stop now. To stand on the brink of discovery, to touch the edge of something unseen by human eyes for 3 millennia, was a temptation no scholar could resist. By afternoon, they had cleared the debris from the threshold. Beneath the drifted sand lay a heavy stone door, its surface covered in a faint patina that glimmered like old bronze. A narrow seam ran down its centre, where 2 panels met, sealed long ago with plaster and painted over with the royal insignia of the sun disk. Alistair ran his hand across it. The heat of the stone stung his skin. He leaned close, pressing his ear against the surface, listening. At first there was only silence, a deep, resonant kind of silence, the silence of weight and age. But then, just as he began to draw back, there came a sound so soft he almost thought it imagined a low vibration, steady and rhythmic, as though the stone itself was humming. It was not random, it was patterned, deliberate, almost musical. He stepped back quickly, blinking in the bright light. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Hamid frowned. "Hear what?" "The sound from within." Hamid pressed his ear against the door. After a moment, he shook his head. "Nothing, doctor. Only stone. Listen again." They stood together in silence. The workers paused their shovels, watching. The desert seemed to hold its breath. For an instant, a faint tremor rippled through the air, not enough to move sand, but enough to feel. Then it was gone. Hamid stepped back, uneasy. "It is the heat," he said. "The rock sings when the sun burns it. That is all." Alistair said nothing. But as he turned away, he could have sworn he heard it again, faint, persistent, a pulse echoing deep within the cliff. That evening, after the day's notes were written and the men had retired to their tents, Alistair sat alone beside the fire, the desert stretching silent and vast around him. The heat of the day had given way to a cold so sudden it seemed unnatural. He wrapped his coat tighter and gazed toward the excavation pit. The moon had risen full and white, casting the entire site in a ghostly glow. The doorway gleamed faintly, like an eye half open. He closed his notebook and stood, walking down toward the pit. The sand was cold underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of stone and salt. As he neared the doorway, a gust of wind rose, gentle but purposeful, swirling around him in spirals that made the flame of his lantern dance. He set it down near the stone door, its light flickering across the carvings. The hieroglyphs seemed to shift in the shadows, their meanings alive, mutable. He placed a hand on the door again. The vibration was stronger, now steady, almost like a heartbeat. And then, as if drawn out by his touch, a whisper came, so faint it trembled on the edge of hearing. "Find me." Alistair froze. His mouth went dry. The whisper was neither male nor female. It carried a tone that felt ancient, layered, as though 1,000 voices spoke at once. He swallowed hard. "Neferet," he whispered. "Is that your name?" The air grew colder. "Find me." He staggered back, heart pounding. For a long moment he stood there, trembling, staring at the sealed door. Then, slowly, the rational part of his mind reasserted itself. The sound could have come from within an air pocket, an echo, perhaps even the shifting of the rock caused by the temperature drop. He told himself this, repeated it silently, until the trembling stopped. But as he turned to leave, the lantern light flickered, and for a split second the shadow of the door stretched upward, twisting into a shape that looked almost human, tall, veiled, and watching. When he blinked, it was gone. The following morning, he ordered the seal broken. The men worked reluctantly, chiseling away the plaster and prying at the heavy stones, until, with a deep groan, the door shifted inward. A rush of air escaped, dry, stale, and cold, carrying with it the scent of dust and ancient myrrh. It was as if the tomb had exhaled after holding its breath for 3,000 years. Inside lay darkness thick, absolute. Alistair lit a torch and stepped forward. The flame sputtered, then steadied, casting a pool of trembling light that revealed a sloping passageway leading down into the earth. The walls were smooth, painted with faint traces of color, reds, blues, and golds dulled by centuries but still luminous. As the others followed, their footsteps echoed strangely, the sound not quite matching the rhythm of their steps. They descended slowly. The air grew cooler, denser. The torchlight revealed scenes along the walls, processions of priests, offerings of lotus and incense, figures kneeling before a woman whose face had been deliberately erased. Only her form remained regal, graceful, unmistakably royal. Her hands were outstretched, palms upward, as though she were offering herself to the gods, or perhaps receiving something from them. Alistair paused before one such image, tracing the outline of her missing face. "Why erase her?" he murmured. What was she forbidden to be? Behind him, Hamid crossed himself in silence. They reached the bottom of the passage, where the air felt unnaturally still. Ahead lay a doorway blocked by a slab of stone, carved with a single hieroglyph, the symbol of a tongue bound by a serpent. Beneath it, in smaller script, were the words, "Her voice endures. Beware the silence that listens." The men hesitated. Even Alistair, for the first time, felt the chill of doubt, yet curiosity triumphed. "We'll stop here for now," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we'll open the inner chamber. The rest devised. To know now. Please now be free." That night, sleep eluded him entirely. The desert outside was silent, too silent. Even the insects seemed to have retreated. He lay in his tent, staring at the fabric glowing faintly in the moonlight, and thought he heard it again. The low hum, steady as breath, echoing beneath the sand. It came and went, like the beating of a heart too large to be contained by the earth. When he finally drifted into a shallow sleep, the dream came again. He was standing in the sloping passageway, torch in hand, but the walls were no longer painted. They were alive, shifting, the figures on them turning their heads to watch him as he passed. Ahead stood a figure in white linen, her face veiled, her hands clasped before her. She whispered his name not aloud, but inside him, and when he reached out to lift the veil, he awoke. Outside, the horizon was beginning to pale. The wind had risen again, whispering softly across the dunes, carrying with it the faintest echo, a rhythm, a voice, a memory. The desert was speaking, and it would not stop. The first doorway, the The morning sun rose like a blade of white fire over the desert ridge, and with it came the sound of tools striking stone, slow, methodical, and strangely subdued, as though the men feared to disturb something listening beneath their feet. The air shimmered with heat already, and every strike sent tiny echoes ricocheting off the cliff walls, vanishing into the stillness below. Alistair Wynne stood at the edge of the excavation pit, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the stone slab that sealed the inner chamber. The night had left him pale and hollow-eyed, though he would not admit to having slept poorly. His notes from dawn were neat and precise, yet his handwriting trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the fever of anticipation. The slab they faced was enormous, fitted so perfectly into its frame that not even a sheet of papyrus could have slipped between it and the wall. Its surface bore carvings so delicate that they seemed almost painted by shadow, lines of script, faint but clear, spiraling inward around a single emblem at the center, the feather of Ma'at, again, but inverted, pointing downward. Alistair studied it with fascination. To invert a divine symbol was heresy, yet here it was, preserved in secret beneath the earth. It was as though the builders themselves had wished to hide something not from time, but from heaven. "Careful," he said quietly as the men positioned wedges beneath the edges of the slab. "We must preserve the inscriptions. They think that what Highland to these four, and Frej, and Wand Pry." Hamid murmured something to the workers in Arabic, a prayer perhaps, though the words were too low to catch. The men hesitated, exchanging glances. At last, one of them struck the wedge with a hammer. The sound was sharp, clean, and then oddly, it seemed to echo back from within, a hollow resonance that did not fade but deepened, rolling like distant thunder. The men froze. Alistair frowned. "Again," he said, "another strike." The echo returned, louder now, richer, as though the stone itself was responding. Then, very slowly, the slab began to shift. Dust spilled from the seams. A breath of air escaped, cool, dry, and heavy with the scent of myrrh and something older, something metallic, like the tang of blood on bronze. The men stepped back as the door leaned inward, groaning with the weight of ages. The moment it opened, the temperature dropped. The sun still blazed overhead, yet the air that spilled from within was cold enough to raise goose flesh on their arms. A faint mist unfurled across the threshold, rippling like smoke before vanishing into the heat. Alistair held up his torch and stepped forward. "Stay close," he murmured. The chamber beyond was narrow, its ceiling low, supported by pillars carved with figures of goddesses whose faces had been deliberately scratched away. Along the walls, murals glimmered faintly under the torchlight, scenes of offerings, of celestial boats sailing through the night sky, of a woman standing before a scale, her heart weighed against the feather of truth. Yet even here, wherever her image appeared, her name had been erased, her features gouged out. The paint was ancient, but the violence that marred it still seemed fresh. Alistair ran his hand lightly across the wall. "They tried to erase her soul," he said softly, "but they couldn't destroy her presence." "Is it Mose Frey?" Hamid stood beside him, uneasy. "Doctor, this place is wrong. It feels awake." Alistair turned, his face lit by the flickering light. "Alive, perhaps. The Egyptians believed their tombs were not for the dead, but for eternity, houses of becoming, not decay. Maybe she is only waiting for someone to remember." As they moved deeper, they found a small alcove to the left, containing a low stone table covered in dust. Upon it lay a clay jar, unbroken, sealed with pitch, and stamped with a hieratic mark. Alistair lifted it carefully, turning it in his hands. "An offering vessel," he murmured. "See the symbol? Water, purification, perhaps part of a burial rite." He set it aside and turned toward the rear wall, where a second passage seemed to descend. This must lead to the main chamber. But before he could step forward, the torchlight flickered violently, then steadied, and in that moment, every shadow on the wall shifted. The figures painted there seemed to move, ever so slightly, their heads turning, their arms raising, their faces, though erased, tilting toward the intruders. The air trembled. Hamid gasped. "Do you see it?" Alistair whispered. "I see only darkness," Hamid said hoarsely, crossing himself again. "Darkness that moves. Ancientmystery." He raised the torch higher, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw her, a woman's silhouette, robed and veiled, standing at the far end of the chamber, her hands extended as if to beckon. The light wavered, and she was gone. The men behind him began to murmur, their voices trembling. Alistair turned sharply. "Enough. It's only shadow. Continue the work." But even as he said it, he felt the cold sweat on his palms. They cleared the last of the debris from the descending passage. It led downward at a steep angle, carved directly into the limestone. The walls here were different, smoother, undecorated, as though the builders had run out of time or had wished to conceal what lay below. The air was heavier still, the scent of age almost tangible. Halfway down, Alistair paused. He could hear something faint, a resonance, deep and steady, echoing up the passage. It was not wind, nor was it the shifting of stone. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like breathing. He turned to Hamid. "Do you hear it now?" Hamid hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he whispered, "but it comes from everywhere and nowhere." The sound grew clearer as they descended. Each step seemed to draw them closer, not merely to the tomb, but to some vast, unseen presence that waited patiently in the dark. When at last they reached the bottom, the passage opened into a circular antechamber, its floor inlaid with black and red stone forming the pattern of a lotus surrounded by serpents. In the center stood a single statue, a woman, life-sized, carved from obsidian so polished it reflected the torchlight like water. Her features, unlike those on the walls, had not been defaced. She was beautiful, serene, her eyes half closed, her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. At her feet was a small inscription, faint but legible. "The mouth speaks, though the name is silenced." Alistair felt his breath catch. "She survived," he whispered. "Even when they tried to erase her, someone preserved her here." He knelt, examining the base of the statue. It was hollow, fitted with a seam. He pried gently with the edge of his trowel until a small compartment opened, revealing a fragment of papyrus, dry and brittle as old skin. Carefully, he unrolled it just enough to see the first few symbols. They were not funerary rites. They were a confession. "I write in darkness." She spoke the words of the beginning, and the sky trembled. The priest sealed her not for sin, but for knowledge that burned brighter than the Sunday. I could not destroy her name, so I hid it in silence. May the silence guard her until she is remembered. The writing stopped abruptly, torn at the edge. Alistair stared at it, heart pounding. "Knowledge that burned brighter than the sun," he murmured. What could that mean? Hamid swallowed. "It means she angered the gods." Alistair turned the papyrus over, but the reverse was blank. He tucked it carefully into his notebook. "Or she understood them," he said. They lingered a while longer, studying the statue, sketching the room, but the air had grown so heavy that even Alistair felt the strain of it. The torches burned dim, the flame bending as if drawn toward the stone walls. When they finally climbed back up to the surface, the light of the sun felt almost blinding, unreal. The men refused to work again that day. They muttered of bad omens, of the goddess of truth inverted, of the whispering door. One of them swore he had seen eyes in the darkness that were not carved but living. Another claimed his name had been spoken from behind him, though no one stood there. Hamid tried to calm them, but his voice lacked conviction. Alistair dismissed them for the evening and retreated to his tent. The papyrus lay on his table, its faded ink glimmering faintly in the lantern light. He studied the words again, tracing the curves of the ancient script. "I hid it in silence." What if the tomb itself was that silence, a vast mechanism designed to conceal her truth, to protect it, until one worthy enough came to listen? He leaned back, closing his eyes. The hum was there again, faint but constant, beneath the ground, beneath his very heartbeat. He could almost imagine that if he listened long enough, it would shape itself into words. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rushing across the dunes, rattling the tent walls. For a moment, it sounded almost like laughter, low, sorrowful, eternal. The first doorway had opened, and through it, the desert was beginning to speak in earnest. The curse unfolds. By the next morning, the men were reluctant to descend into the tomb. The memory of the whispering door and the cold breath of the sealed chamber still haunted them. Their shovels lay untouched beside the pit, their eyes avoiding the dark mouth in the earth. Even the camels, usually indifferent beasts, refused to rest near the excavation site, tugging at their ropes whenever the wind carried a sound from the direction of the cliff. Hamid argued quietly with the workers in Arabic, his voice taut with frustration and fear. Alistair Wynne stood apart, gazing at the horizon where the dunes shimmered like waves frozen in mid-motion. The sky was cloudless, the air still, yet the desert seemed to hum, as if vibrating with the memory of what had been awakened. He could not blame the men for their fear. Something had changed since the door had been breached. The night after the first entry, Alistair had been roused by distant cries, sharp, panicked, swiftly muffled. When he rushed outside, he found one of the labourers, a young man named Karim, sprawled near the pit, his face pale and his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. There was no wound, no mark of struggle. His companions swore he had been sleeping until he suddenly sat up, whispered something unintelligible, and walked straight into the desert. When they caught him and brought him back, he collapsed lifeless in their arms. Alistair examined him by lantern light. The boy's pulse had stopped, yet his expression was eerily calm, as though he had died mid-dream. On his tongue was a faint trace of gold dust too fine to be sand. No one could explain it. The body was buried before dawn, far from camp, without ceremony. That morning, Alistair wrote a single line in his notebook. The curse begins not with death, but with remembrance. It is parser, it's too harse of harser, and wanted expected. Now, as he watched the men's hesitation, he felt a flicker of unease himself. The scientist in him whispered that it was coincidence, the exhaustion of labour, the heat, the fear infecting their minds like contagion. But another part, the one that had felt the voice beneath the sand, knew that coincidence was too small a word for what was happening. Hamid approached, his brow furrowed. "Doctor, they will not go below again. They say the air in the tomb is poison. They say the boy's spirit was taken." "Taken?" Alistair repeated, his voice flat. "They believe she claimed him, the woman without a name. They say she needs the living to remember her, to feed on their breath. Inside her," Alistair sighed, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Superstition. The air is old, nothing more. Carbon dioxide, perhaps. We'll ventilate the chambers today. I'll go down myself." Hamid's expression tightened. "You should not go alone. Then come with me." Hamid hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Together, they gathered fresh torches and descended once more into the tomb. The air within was still cold, though the heat outside was unbearable. Their breath condensed faintly in the torchlight. The shadows seemed deeper, the colours of the murals more vivid. As they passed the obsidian statue, Alistair paused again before the inscription at its base. The mouth speaks, though the name is silenced. He traced the letters with his fingers, half expecting the stone to pulse under his touch. Further inside, they reached the circular chamber they had uncovered the previous day. The floor mosaic, the lotus surrounded by serpents, seemed to shimmer faintly, as though something beneath it moved. Alistair crouched to examine it more closely. "Look," he said softly. "These tiles, they're not fixed. See the pattern? The serpents form a spiral, not a ring. It's as if they're coiled around something." Hamid shifted uneasily. "Perhaps we should leave it closed." But Alistair was already brushing the dust from the centre tile. Beneath it, the faint outline of a seam became visible, a perfect circle, so fine it could barely be seen. "A hidden chamber," he murmured. "A tomb within a tomb." He pressed his palm to the centre tile. It gave slightly beneath the weight, and somewhere beneath the floor came a low, resonant sound, a sigh, long and drawn out. The air stirred, the torch flickered. Hamid stepped back sharply. "Doctor, stop, please!" But the mechanism had already engaged. The spiral of tiles began to shift, grinding softly as dust fell in shimmering veils. A round slab in the centre slowly descended, revealing a dark hollow beneath. From it rose a breath of air so cold it burned. It smelled of myrrh and something else, something faintly sweet, almost floral, yet laced with decay. Alistair leaned over the opening, holding the torch low. The light vanished into blackness. "A burial shaft," he said quietly. "Deeper than I thought. Hand me the rope." Hamid caught his wrist. "No. You go down there, and you may not return." Alistair met his eyes. "If she is down there, if this truly is her resting place, then I must see it. History doesn't yield its secrets to the timid." He tied the rope around his waist and began to descend, the torch clutched between his teeth. The shaft was narrow, smooth, and strangely warm in places, as if the stone itself pulsed with trapped breath. The air grew thicker as he went, heavy with the scent of ancient oils. When his feet finally touched solid ground, he found himself standing in a chamber barely large enough to stand upright. The torchlight revealed walls covered not with paintings, but with text endless lines of hieroglyphs, so densely carved that they seemed to move under the flickering flame. He turned slowly, reading fragments aloud. The words of return, the gates of breath. The one who speaks the names of the dead shall live again. He was right on the singing. The Rafla, and there, intanging. His voice echoed oddly, as though another voice repeated each word half a heartbeat later. He frowned, turning in a slow circle. "Hamid?" He called up the shaft. There was no answer, only the faint, steady echo of his own voice, delayed, distorted. Then, from somewhere behind him, a whisper. "You came?" He spun around, nearly dropping the torch. The chamber was empty, yet the air moved a subtle ripple, as though something unseen had brushed past. The whisper came again, closer now. "You found me." Alistair's pulse thundered in his ears. "Neferet," he breathed. The flame trembled violently, flaring blue for an instant before settling. The voice seemed to sigh a sound of relief, almost gratitude. "So long. I waited in silence. You remember." He swallowed hard. "Who were you?" "The one who spoke before the dawn. The one who saw the gods unmasked." The torchlight flickered again, revealing something at the far end of the chamber. A stone coffin, its surface blackened with age, half buried under a fall of sand. The lid was carved with the figure of a woman, her arms crossed, her face serene, her eyes open. Around her neck was a necklace of gold inlaid with turquoise, each bead shaped like a tear. The inscription above it read, "Neferet, daughter of Ra, keeper of the hidden name, and die last." For a moment, Alistair could not breathe. The name erased from the world, preserved only here. His discovery was beyond measure. He reached out, brushing the dust from the inscription. "You were real," he whispered. "You lived, and died for what I spoke." The voice was different now, no longer faint, but firm, resonant, filling the chamber without sound. His mind reeled. "What did you speak?" "The word that binds the breath of life, the name that gods feared. They sealed me so the world would forget. But you," her voice softened, wrapping around him like silk. "You listened." He felt the air grow heavier, pressing against his chest. The torchlight dimmed. Somewhere above, Hamid shouted his name, but the sound came from far away, as though through water. The hum returned deep, rhythmic, echoing through the stone. It pulsed in time with his heartbeat. Then, suddenly, a sound like shattering glass filled the air. The lid of the sarcophagus cracked, splitting along its center. A rush of cold air burst outward, extinguishing the torch. Darkness engulfed him. In the blackness, the hum rose into a chorus of whispers, countless voices murmuring at once, names, prayers, fragments of forgotten tongues. And beneath them all, clear and steady, her voice, "Do not fear. You woke me. Now remember." A blinding light flared behind his eyes. He saw visions fleeting, dazzling a temple of gold, priests kneeling before a woman whose face was radiant with power, the sky opening like a door, a circle of men sealing a tomb with trembling hands. He saw her name erased, her image shattered, her voice fading into the silence beneath the sands. Then, just as suddenly, the visions were gone, the light faded, the hum ceased. The torch reignited on the ground beside him, though he had not touched it. The sarcophagus lay silent again, its crack sealed as if it had never been. He stood there, trembling, breath shallow, staring at the unbroken stone. Had it happened? Was it madness? He could not tell, but he knew one thing. She had spoken, and he had heard. When he climbed back to the surface, his face was ashen. Hamid rushed to meet him, eyes wide. "What did you see?" Alistair looked toward the horizon, where the first hints of evening gilded the dunes in blood-red light. His voice was barely a whisper. "The beginning," he said, "and the end." That night, a sandstorm swept across the valley, sudden and violent. The tents shuddered, ropes snapped, the air filled with a roar like the sea. Lightning flashed in the distance, a rare, unnatural thing in that dry land. Amid the chaos, some swore they heard laughter carried on the wind, soft, melodic, unmistakably human. And far beneath the sand, deep within the sealed tomb, the faint hum began again, steady, rhythmic, and alive. Descent into silence. When dawn came, the desert seemed newly born. The storm had scoured the land clean, leaving behind a strange, glistening stillness, as though the dunes had been polished to glass. The air was cool for the first time in days, and the early light struck the cliffs in pale gold, revealing the hollow mouths of caves that had been half buried before the wind had passed. Yet within the camp, there was no sense of renewal, only exhaustion. The storm had stolen sleep from every man. The tents were torn, supplies scattered, and one of the camels had broken its tether and vanished into the dunes during the night. Alistair Wynne stood at the edge of the excavation pit, coat drawn tight against the chill. He had not slept at all. His mind still burned with the visions from the night before the temple, the veiled woman, the word that had filled the sky like thunder. He could not recall the word itself, though he remembered its feeling, a vibration that shook the world and lingered in the marrow of his bones. He had written about it in his notebook just before dawn, his handwriting slanted and feverish. The name is not sound but essence. She spoke it. The gods silenced her to preserve the world. If spoken again, what would awaken? Now, as he watched the sun climb higher, he wondered if the silence that followed was not a prison but a kind of mercy. The men had grown restless. 2 of them had already packed their things, vowing to return to Luxor by midday. "The storm was her anger," Hamid said, his voice grim. "She warned us. Or she revealed herself," Alistair replied quietly. Hamid's eyes flashed. "You still speak as if this is discovery, not doom. Doctor, we are trespassing in the house of a forgotten god." "Not a god," Alistair corrected. "A woman who understood them, indeed. Teloin, by." But even as he spoke, he heard how hollow the words sounded. He turned toward the tomb entrance, its shadow stretching long and black across the sand. The idea of descending again filled him with both dread and yearning. Something in that darkness called to him, not with menace, but with promise. The voice had not lied. She had waited, and she had chosen him. By noon, the men who wished to leave were gone, taking with them 2 camels and most of the fresh water. Only Hamid and one other, an older digger named Farouk, remained. 3 men against the desert, Hamid muttered bitterly as they ate a silent meal beneath the canvas awning. 3 are enough, Alistair said. "We are close now. There's another passage below the burial chamber." "I saw it before the torch went out." Hamid looked at him sharply. "You didn't mention that before. I wasn't certain. But I am now. If we can reach it, we might find her writings or evidence of what she discovered. The papyrus we found spoke of a knowledge forbidden. Perhaps the answer lies deeper." Farouk, who had been silent until then, spoke up in a low voice. "Doctor, some knowledge should remain buried." Alistair met his gaze. "Perhaps, but history does not forgive silence. It forgets it. If she was condemned for understanding something beyond her time, we owe her remembrance. That risalso wit tre." The argument ended there, but tension hung between them like a drawn bow. By late afternoon, they had gathered their tools and lanterns and descended once more into the tomb. The air felt thicker than before, as though the storm above had compressed the very atmosphere underground. The torches burned with long, low flames that guttered at every step. The murals seemed sharper, the colours deeper, their figures more alive. Alistair noticed for the first time that the goddess depictions Isis, Hathor, Ma'at, all faced inward, their eyes turned toward the direction of the burial chamber, as though paying homage to whatever lay within. When they reached the obsidian statue, Alistair stopped. Something about it was different. The faint smile on its lips seemed altered deeper, almost knowing. He stared at it for a long moment before shaking off the thought. "Bring the lantern closer," he said. They moved to the circular chamber, the spiral of serpents glinting faintly beneath the sand. The central slab they had opened the day before remained slightly ajar, though it now appeared narrower, as if the stone had shifted overnight. Alistair knelt beside it, brushing away the dust. "There," he murmured. "You see the slope? The air current moves downward. There must be another chamber beneath." Hamid shook his head. "After what happened, you still want to go deeper?" Alistair looked up at him, eyes bright. "Hamid, don't you see? The entire tomb is built like a voice, a structure that descends into silence. Every passage funnels inward, like the throat of a god. We haven't reached its heart yet." Hamid hesitated, then sighed. "If we go together, but no further than the next chamber." Farouk crossed himself again and muttered a prayer. "May the silence keep us." They lowered the rope once more. The descent was steeper than before, the walls damp and close. This time, the air was not cold but warm, unnaturally so, like breath on skin. At the bottom, Alistair found himself standing in a long corridor lined with what looked like mirrors. He lifted his torch, and the reflections flared into being not his own face, but countless others, distorted by the curve of the obsidian surface. Some were serene, others twisted in silent screams. Hamid gasped softly. "What is this place?" Alistair stepped closer to one of the panels. Polished volcanic glass, they used it for ritual chambers to reflect the light of the afterlife. But these... He reached out to touch the surface. His reflection rippled, and for a moment it was not his face he saw, but hers, the woman from his vision. Veiled, her eyes bright as stars. She lifted her hand as if to touch his. He stumbled back, the torch wavering. The image vanished. Hamid's voice was hoarse. "You saw her, didn't you?" Alistair hesitated, then nodded. "I think so." They moved slowly down the corridor, their reflections watching them from every side. The further they went, the more distorted the images became, as if the glass itself was bending around something unseen. The hum that had haunted them before returned, now faint but steady, vibrating through the soles of their feet. It pulsed in rhythm, like the beating of an immense heart deep beneath the earth. At the end of the passage, they came upon another door, smaller, yet more elaborate than any before. It was carved from black granite and studded with gold that still gleamed as if freshly polished. Across its surface ran lines of inscription that wound together in a spiral. Alistair read them aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Here ends the breath of the world, and begins the echo. She who spoke shall now listen. He who listens shall remember." He traced the final symbol, an ear inside a circle, and smiled faintly. "The Chamber of Silence," he said. "We've found it." Hamid's face had gone pale. "And if we open it?" Alistair's expression softened, almost tender. "Then we finish what time began." He pressed his hand to the door. The stone was warm, warmer than human skin. Beneath his palm, he felt a faint vibration, as if something on the other side breathed in answer. Slowly, almost reverently, he pushed. The door gave way with a sigh that echoed through the corridor, carrying with it a rush of air so deep and resonant that the torches flickered violently. Beyond lay darkness vast, soundless, absolute. The air was cool again, yet somehow alive, as if filled with a presence that had been waiting too long. Alistair stepped inside. The silence hit him like a wave. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something larger, a silence that listened. Every footstep seemed swallowed before it could echo. The walls were smooth, curving inward toward a dome that glimmered faintly with gold dust suspended in the air, catching the torchlight like constellations. At the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal. Upon it rested a single object, a scroll case carved from alabaster, its surface etched with the same inverted feather he had seen before. He approached slowly. The air around it felt heavy, vibrating with the same low hum that had haunted the tomb. He reached out, and for a heartbeat, the silence deepened into something almost physical, pressing against his ears. Then, faintly, a whisper bloomed within that silence. You came deeper than any before. He froze. "Neferet," he said, "you carry my name." The sound was within him, not around him. His mind filled with visions, her face again, unveiled this time, eyes dark as night, lips curved in that same sorrowful smile. She spoke, and though her words were not in any language he knew, he understood them. The world was not ready for truth. The gods were not gods but names, and I learned the first of them. I spoke it, and the sky wept fire. They sealed my mouth, but the word remains. Now you have heard it in your dreams. It seeks a voice again. He reached out to the scroll case. What is in there? The memory, my confession, my curse. He hesitated, but curiosity was stronger than fear. He lifted the case. It was lighter than he expected, almost hollow. When he opened it, a thin ribbon of dust rose into the air, and with it, a sound like a sigh. Inside was a single sheet of papyrus, blank, except for one symbol painted in red, the same feather inverted once more. Before he could speak, the silence shattered. The hum became a roar, rushing up from the floor, through the walls, through him. The torches flared and died. For a heartbeat, he saw her standing before him, tall, radiant, her eyes luminous. She whispered something, a word he could not remember, even as he heard it, and then she was gone. The light returned. The chamber was empty. The scroll case lay on the floor, cracked, the papyrus crumbling into dust. Hamid found him standing motionless, eyes distant. "Doctor," he whispered. Alistair turned slowly, his voice calm but hollow. "She's awake," he said, "and she remembers us all." The descent into silence was complete. But from that silence, something had begun to listen back. The chamber of mirrors. The following days bled into one another, as though the sun had forgotten its rhythm. The air above the valley was heavy and white, and the wind, when it came, carried whispers that sounded almost human. The camp had grown smaller, the workers gone, the tents collapsing one by one under the weight of drifting sand. Only 3 remained: Alistair Wynne, Hamid, and Farouk, the last of the loyal, though loyalty now was more akin to fear than faith. The tomb's entrance yawned like a wound in the cliffside, its shadow long and accusing. Alistair spent each morning inside it, as though drawn downward by some invisible tether. He told himself he was cataloguing, recording, mapping the architectural plan of the burial complex, but in truth, he was searching for something the Queen had promised but not revealed. The word that had trembled at the edge of his mind since that first whisper. The word he could no longer remember, but could feel pulsing beneath the surface of thought, like a heartbeat. Hamid watched him uneasily. The Englishman's once orderly demeanour had shifted into obsession. He spoke less now, and when he did, his voice carried the faint echo of reverence, as if he were no longer studying the tomb but conversing with it. At night, he would wake suddenly, sit bolt upright, and murmur in a language that neither Hamid nor Farouk could recognize. On the 4th morning after their descent into the Chamber of Silence, Hamid found Alistair already below, torch in hand, standing once more in the corridor of black glass, the Chamber of Mirrors. "Doctor," Hamid called, his voice thin and hesitant. "You said we would not go deeper without rest." Alistair did not turn. "Rest," he said softly. "How can one rest when eternity breathes just beneath the stone?" Hamid's voice trembled. "There is no breath down here, only death." But Alistair barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on the walls, where his reflection shimmered like liquid shadow. The surface of the obsidian was alive, each faint flicker of flame birthing dozens of faces, his own, Hamid's, Farouk's, each slightly altered, each moving a fraction out of time. One smiled when he did not, one blinked after he turned away, another seemed to whisper something soundless behind the glass. "It's not mere reflection," Alistair murmured. "It's memory. These mirrors, they remember what has passed, every step, every breath recorded in the stone." Hamid shivered. "You speak madness." "Madness?" Alistair's eyes glinted in the torchlight. "No, Hamid. Magic. The Egyptians believed mirrors were portals, gateways to the world of spirits. But these were not made to summon the dead, they were made to listen to them. Look, he raised his hand to the wall. The flame of the torch rippled across the surface, and the black glass seemed to ripple with its slow waves, like the surface of a pond disturbed by unseen hands. Then, faintly, images began to appear, not reflections now, but scenes. The color drained and shifted, as though the stone itself were bleeding out light. They saw figures moving through the same corridor. Thousands of years ago, priests in linen robes, their faces solemn, carrying torches and scrolls. At their head walked a woman, tall and veiled, her posture regal, her movements graceful. The mirrors caught her from every angle, revealing her face as she passed. The same face Alistair had seen in his visions. Neferet, Hamid gasped. It's her. The image flickered, wavered, and then sound began to bleed into the chamber, faint at first, then growing clearer. The rhythmic cadence of a chant. The words were old, older than hieroglyphs, older than the Nile's first flow. The priests' voices blended with a hum that had haunted the tomb since they opened it. May silence hold the word, may darkness guard its breath. The chant faded, replaced by the sound of a woman speaking. Her voice was calm, measured, yet filled with sorrow. I spoke what was forbidden. The gods heard and trembled, so they erased my name. But names are not erased, only buried, and what is buried is reborn. Alistair stood transfixed, the torch trembling in his hand. The scene shifted again, the priests sealing the door, their faces pale with dread. Then, one by one, they turned to look at something unseen beyond the frame, their mouths opening in silent cries. The light in the mirrors dimmed, and the reflections snapped back to the present. Hamid took a step back, crossing himself. "This is not for us," he whispered. "This is the place of her memory. We must leave it." But Alistair stepped forward, his voice low. "No, Hamid, don't you see? She's showing us what happened. She wants to be remembered, to be understood." Hamid's voice rose in fear. "And what if remembrance is her vengeance? What if every word we speak gives her strength?" Alistair turned, his eyes fever bright. "Then let her speak. Let her tell the truth the gods tried to hide." The mirrors shimmered again, reacting to his words. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine golden threads, and then, as though summoned by the very act of speaking her name, her reflection appeared once more. Neferet stood behind them, though when they turned, the corridor was empty. Only her image remained, mirrored infinitely along the black walls. She wore no veil now. Her hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders, and her eyes vast, ancient, knowing, fixed on Alistair, with an intensity that rooted him in place. "You seek truth," she whispered, her voice both within and around them. "But truth is a mirror once shattered. It cuts all who touch it." The torches dimmed, the air thickened. Hamid fell to his knees, muttering prayers. Alistair raised his hand toward the nearest mirror. "What truth did you see, Neferet? What was the word?" The image tilted its head, almost pitying. "The word that wakes the world. The sound that breathes the stars. I spoke it once, and men called me cursed. But you, who hear my voice, you remember it already." Her reflection raised a hand, pressing it against the inside of the glass. Without thinking, Alistair mirrored the gesture. The moment his palm touched the surface, the world seemed to tilt. The glass turned fluid beneath his skin, rippling outward like water. His reflection vanished, replaced entirely by her. For a heartbeat, he was nowhere suspended between breath and silence, between thought and dream. Images flooded his mind again. The temple at dawn, the Nile glittering beneath an orange sun, the cries of priests as they sealed the tomb. He saw Neferet kneeling before an altar, her hands raised, her lips forming that same word he could never quite remember. The air had shimmered, and the walls had cracked like thunder. The gods, or something older than gods, had answered. When he pulled his hand away, the mirror shattered not into pieces, but into ripples that spread across every surface, merging the reflections into a single, swirling pool of light. The hum turned to a deep, resonant tone that filled the entire tomb, vibrating through their bones. Hamid shouted his name, but Alistair barely heard him. The light surged outward, then collapsed back into the mirrors. When it cleared, the images were gone. Only their reflections remained, though distorted now, as if the glass remembered too much. In the silence that followed, Alistair sank to his knees, his breathing ragged. His palm throbbed where it had touched the glass. When he lifted it, he saw a faint mark burned into the skin, the inverted feather of Ma'at. Hamid stared at it in horror. "You've been marked." Alistair looked at the mark calmly, almost wonderingly. "She's chosen me," he whispered. "Her voice needs a vessel. Perhaps that's all she ever wanted, to be heard again." Hamid backed away. "No, you've given her passage. You've opened the way." But Alistair only smiled faintly, his voice soft and reverent. "Then let her speak." A low vibration rolled through the floor, like the distant rumble of thunder beneath the earth. The torches flared and died, plunging them into darkness. In that dark, the mirrors began to glow faintly, one by one, until the entire corridor shimmered with silver light, and from every wall, every surface, came the same whispered dozens of voices, layered, echoing through the stone. "Remember me." Hamid stumbled backward, dragging Farouk toward the stair. Alistair remained where he was, surrounded by the light, his face calm, his eyes half closed as though listening to a symphony no one else could hear. When Hamid reached the top of the shaft and looked back, he saw Alistair still standing amid the mirrors, the glow reflecting off him like fire. For a heartbeat, the Englishman turned his head and smiled, but it was not entirely his own smile. Then the light vanished, and the tomb fell silent once more. Outside, the desert wind rose again, carrying a sound that might have been laughter, or weeping, or both. The chamber of mirrors had shown its truth, and it had not released what it reflected, the forgotten queen. When the dawn came again, it was dull and grey, a strange colour for the Egyptian sky. The sun, usually fierce and absolute, hung veiled behind a thin haze that dimmed its brilliance and cast the valley in a wan, uncertain light. It was as though the heavens themselves were reluctant to look upon the land below. The camp was quiet, the wind had fallen, and the sand lay still, pressed flat as if by some vast invisible weight. No bird cried, no camel stirred. The only movement came from Hamid, who crouched near the dying embers of the fire, murmuring prayers under his breath. Farouk had not returned from the tomb. He had gone down after Alistair the previous night, his lantern disappearing into the dark of the shaft, and then nothing. No sound, no cry, not even the faintest echo of his footsteps. Hamid had waited until sunrise before daring to look, but the rope that led downward hung slack and cold. Now he sat with his back to the wind, his face drawn and weary. He had spent his life near tombs, digging, guiding, translating, but never had he felt the desert so completely alive. It was as though the very sand had begun to breathe. He did not dare descend again, not after what he had seen in those mirrors, the endless reflections that had moved when he did not. But he could not leave, either. Something duty, fear, perhaps pity held him here, watching the mouth of the tomb like a man keeping vigil at the bedside of a dying friend. When at last Alistair emerged, it was without sound. He came from the darkness slowly, like a shadow climbing into light. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dust, but his eyes had changed. They seemed both brighter and older, filled with a calm that did not belong to him. He blinked at the daylight as though it pained him. "Farouk," Hamid whispered. Alistair's gaze shifted, but there was no recognition in it, only a kind of distant sorrow. "He's gone," he said softly. He saw her face. It was too much for him. "Is a fount of pays the wands on these while." Hamid's throat tightened. "You mean he's dead?" Alistair tilted his head slightly, considering. "Dead? Perhaps, but not lost. The mirrors remember everyone who sees them." He smiled faintly, and for an instant Hamid thought he saw something flicker across the Englishman's features. Not madness exactly, but possession, a stillness too complete to belong to any living man. "Doctor," Hamid said cautiously, "we must leave this place. Whatever lies below, it is not meant for us." But Alistair's gaze turned toward the tomb entrance again. "No, Hamid, we've barely begun. You still think she's a ghost, a curse, a myth, but you don't understand. She was real. Neferet was a queen, though history erased her. The tomb told me. The tomb spoke to you? Hamid's voice cracked. She did, Alistair replied simply. She showed me everything who she was, what she saw, why they condemned her. He walked toward the tent and pulled a battered notebook from the table. The pages were filled with tight, meticulous handwriting, some lines overwritten again and again until the ink had bled through. Look, he said, spreading it open. This is what the mirrors revealed. Hamid hesitated before stepping closer. On the page were sketches precise, delicate, drawn with a hand that trembled but did not falter. The first showed a woman seated on a throne of lotus petals, the solar disk above her head flanked by serpents. Around her knelt priests, their faces hidden. The caption beneath read, Neferet, High Priestess of the Hidden Name. She was not just a queen, Alistair continued, his voice low and reverent. She was the keeper of something sacred, the word of breath, the true name of life itself. The priests believed the world was born from sound, from a single utterance of the divine. Neferet found that word. She spoke it aloud. Hamid's eyes widened. Blasphemy. To them, yes, Alistair said. They feared what she had touched. The word was power creation itself, the voice that shapes reality. They said it tore the veil between the living and the divine, and so they silenced her, buried her alive, sealed her name away, but her voice did not die. It echoes in the stone. It's what we hear when the wind stills. He turned another page. There, drawn in careful lines, was the image of the Chamber of Mirrors, its black walls glinting. In the center, a single figure stood, a woman reflected infinitely, her image spreading in every direction. Beneath it, Alistair had written, The truth is not one reflection, but all the sum of every silence. Hamid's mouth went dry. And you believe this? That she, this forgotten queen, spoke the word of the gods? Alistair looked at him, eyes distant. I don't believe it, Hamid. I know it. I saw it. She showed me the day she was condemned. They called her a heretic, a bringer of ruin, but all she did was speak what the gods wish to hide, that the divine and the mortal are the same, that to speak the word is to awaken what sleeps in every soul. He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he traced a line on the page. They tore her name from every wall, every papyrus, but they forgot that the desert remembers. Every grain of sand holds sound, the echo of a name, and now it speaks again. Hamid stepped back. The air around them seemed to hum faintly, though there was no wind. Doctor, he said quietly, you must burn that book. Alistair smiled sadly. You sound like them, the priests who sealed her tomb. But you can't silence truth twice. Truth? Hamid's voice rose. She killed Farouk. She is a spirit of vengeance. But Alistair's tone was calm, almost tender. Vengeance is only memory misunderstood. Hamid stared at him, searching for the man he had once followed into the desert, the precise, rational scholar, the skeptic who laughed at superstition. That man was gone. In his place stood something quieter, more terrible, a believer. That evening, as the sun sank behind the cliffs, Alistair returned to the tomb. Hamid followed at a distance, unable to stop himself. The light was fading fast, the sky streaked with gold and violet. Inside the tomb, the air was colder than before. The mirrors in the corridor shimmered faintly, as though reflecting light that came from nowhere. Alistair walked slowly, his torch held low. She showed me her death, he said softly, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. They brought her here, bound in linen and gold, her mouth sealed with resin. She did not cry out. They thought she would fade like all the others. But as they laid her in the sarcophagus, she whispered, just once, a single word. He stopped, his gaze unfocused. I heard it in the dream, the sound that is not sound. It's what binds the stars, Hamid. The word that keeps the world alive. Hamid swallowed hard. And you mean to speak it? Alistair turned to him slowly. She wants to be remembered, not worshipped. But remembrance has power. I think she chose me to finish what she began. Hamid's fear deepened into despair. Then she has taken your soul. Alistair's expression softened. Perhaps. Or perhaps she's given me hers. He stepped forward into the main chamber. The statue of Neferet stood as it had before, serene, silent, the same faint smile upon her lips. But now, as the torchlight flickered, the statue's eyes seemed to glint with a faint golden light. Alistair approached reverently. "They tried to erase you," he whispered, "but I remember. I will speak your name." Hamid's breath caught. "No, don't." But Alistair's lips moved, forming a sound too soft to hear a breath more than a word. The air trembled, the flame of the torch elongated, bending toward the statue. A low hum rose from the stone, vibrating through the floor. Then silence. Perfect, absolute silence. The flame went out. Hamid stumbled backward, heart hammering, clutching his chest. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light. Then, slowly, a glow began to rise from the statue itself, faint at first, then brightening, illuminating the chamber in a soft, pulsing radiance. It came not from fire or reflection, but from within the stone, as though the queen's spirit had awakened. The light shaped itself into a figure, delicate, human, luminous. She stood before Alistair, her veil dissolving into mist. Her face was both beautiful and terrible, her eyes filled with sadness that spanned eternity. "You remembered me," she said. Her voice was everywhere in the air, in the stone, in their bones. Alistair fell to his knees, his face uplifted in awe. "Your name will not be forgotten again." Caping Modrand and Terektua. "Names are not enough," she murmured. "Only truth endures, but to speak it again is to wake the silence." Hamid shouted for him to stop, but the words were lost in the rising hum. The light grew brighter, swirling around Alistair like a storm of gold and shadow. For an instant he looked back, and his eyes shone with that same golden light. Then the chamber exploded with radiance, blinding, soundless, infinite. When Hamid awoke, he was lying outside the tomb. The air was still, the sun had risen, the entrance was sealed once more, the sand smooth, undisturbed. Alistair was gone. But when the wind rose later that afternoon, it carried a whisper across the dunes, soft, melodic, unmistakably human. Neferet. And though no one would ever believe him, Hamid knew that somewhere beneath the sand, the forgotten queen was no longer forgotten, and that her name, once silenced, was now awake. The mummy's voice. For several days after the desert swallowed the tomb once more, the valley lay in a strange, oppressive stillness. The wind, which normally carried its soft, ceaseless whisper across the dunes, seemed to hold its breath. The air was so still that even the shadows of the cliffs stood motionless, etched upon the pale rock like ancient hieroglyphs. It was as if the desert itself had entered mourning not for the dead, but for something newly awakened, something it had guarded too long. Hamid remained near the site, unable to leave, though every instinct urged him to flee. The memory of light, that terrible radiant silence, haunted him whenever he closed his eyes. He had seen Alistair vanish in that brilliance, not consumed, not burned, but dissolved, as though his body had become one with the air. He could still hear the echo of that last whisper, the name breathed across the ages. Neferet. He had tried to unearth the tomb again in the days that followed, digging where he remembered the entrance to be. But no matter how deep he dug, the sand refilled itself, sliding back into the pit as though alive. The desert had reclaimed her, and now, at night, when the stars shone and the wind returned at last, he sometimes thought he heard a faint sound carried upon it, a woman's voice, soft, melodic, speaking words he could not understand. By the seventh day, he could endure the silence no longer. He packed his few belongings and set off toward Thebes. The journey was long, the sun relentless. When at last he reached the city, he was weak, his face blistered by the heat. Yet his story, told in the markets and to the officials of the Antiquities Service, found only skepticism. Another curse, they said. Another tale for tourists. No one listened. The tomb was declared lost, swallowed by shifting dunes. Years passed. The sands moved, as they always do. The valley changed shape. Seasons came and went, carrying the echoes of memory deeper into the earth. But history, like the desert, never forgets completely. 9. And for lightful reasoned for my, and rife, and I tell. It was the summer of 1939 when the tomb was found again. A team of British and Egyptian archaeologists, surveying an uncharted wadi west of Thebes, uncovered a set of carved stones protruding from the sand. The expedition was led by Professor Arthur Hollings, a meticulous man who had studied under Dr. Alistair Wynne before the latter's mysterious disappearance nearly 2 decades earlier. The name Wynne had become legend among Egyptologists, the brilliant scholar who vanished without a trace in pursuit of a myth. When Hollings brushed the sand from the first block and saw the faint traces of hieroglyphs, his heart quickened. The carvings were unusual, neither fully Old nor New Kingdom in style, but something between. Most striking of all was the central symbol, the inverted feather of Ma'at. It was the same emblem Wynne had mentioned in his surviving notes. Hollings had obtained those notes years before, a small, weather-stained notebook discovered in the archives of the British Institute in Cairo, labelled only Thebes 1922. Its final pages were erratic, fevered, filled with sketches and phrases that hinted at a discovery beyond the reach of death. The last line read simply, "She speaks still, though the world forgets." The professor had dismissed much of it as delusion, the ramblings of a man driven mad by isolation and heat. But as he stood now, staring at the half-buried doorway, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The alignment, the symbols, even the slope of the cliffs, all matched Wynne's description. By evening, the team had cleared the entrance. The stone seal was unbroken, the plaster markings intact, suggesting the tomb had never been breached since antiquity. The air that escaped when they opened it was dry but strangely cool, carrying a faint, sweet scent, not decay, but myrrh. "Remarkable preservation," Hollings murmured as he stepped inside, his lantern casting trembling shadows along the walls. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were painted, though the colours had faded to ghostly outlines. Figures of priests and goddesses lined the corridor, their faces erased, their hands raised toward a single central figure, whose image, though damaged, radiated grace. "See here," Hollings said to his assistant, a young Egyptian archaeologist named Yusuf. "The erasure is deliberate. Whoever she was, they wanted her forgotten." "Like the heretic king," Yusuf replied softly. "Akhenaten. But this seems older." They pressed on, reaching the inner chamber. There, beneath layers of dust, stood a sarcophagus of black granite. It was unadorned save for a single symbol on its lid, the same inverted feather. Around it lay offerings, vessels of alabaster, fragments of jewellery, all remarkably intact. As Yusuf brushed away the sand near the base, he found something else, a small, rusted object, half buried in the corner. When he lifted it, his breath caught. "Sir," he said, "look at this." It was a pocket compass English, early 20th century. The brass casing bore an inscription worn by time. A. W. Hollings stared at it, his throat tightening. "Alistair Wynne," he whispered. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, almost reverently, Hollings placed the compass on a flat stone beside the sarcophagus. "You found it, old friend," he murmured. "You were right. It's raid for the results of Maydig." They set up their instruments and began recording. The chamber was dry, the air unnaturally still. Hollings moved carefully, noting each detail in his field journal. He recorded the temperature markedly lower than outside, and the peculiar resonance of the room, as though the stone itself hummed faintly underfoot. When he leaned close to the sarcophagus, he thought he heard something, a vibration, almost musical, rising from within. He pressed his ear to the cold granite. For an instant, there was silence. Then faintly, unmistakably, a sound like breath. He drew back sharply, heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what, Professor?" Hollings frowned. "Nothing. Perhaps the air moving through cracks." But even as he said it, the hum returned, deeper now, pulsing in rhythm. That night, as the team made camp just outside the tomb, Hollings sat by the fire, notebook open, unable to shake the feeling that the stone had spoken. He wrote in the margin, "Resonance consistent with low-frequency vibration, possibly geological, though it seemed almost patterned." Sleep eluded him. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. Sometime past midnight, he rose and lit his lantern. The moonlight painted the desert silver. The tomb entrance yawned, dark and waiting. He hesitated only a moment before descending. Inside, the air was cooler still, like the breath of an unseen sea. He moved toward the sarcophagus, the lantern casting long shadows that danced upon the walls. The hum was there again, subtle but steady. He leaned closer, and this time, it changed. It rose in tone, almost imperceptibly, shaping itself into sound. Arthur. He froze. The voice was soft, female, and impossibly near. He turned sharply, but the chamber was empty. The flame trembled, throwing wild shapes across the walls. He took a step back. "Who's there?" Silence. Then again, fainter, like a sigh. "Remember." The lantern flickered and went out. When Yusuf found him the next morning, Hollings was seated beside the sarcophagus, eyes open, face serene. His pulse was slow but steady. The lantern lay extinguished at his feet. When Yusuf touched his shoulder, Hollings stirred, blinking as though waking from a dream. "She spoke," he murmured. "Sir?" She whispered my name. He looked down at the sarcophagus. "She's still alive." That day, they opened the lid. Inside lay a woman's form, perfectly preserved. The linen wrappings had darkened with age, but beneath them the shape of her face was unmistakable, delicate, noble, peaceful. A golden amulet rested upon her chest, engraved with a single word, Neferet. When the air touched the wrappings, a faint sigh escaped from within, like a long-held breath released at last. Yusuf stumbled back. "It breathed," he whispered. Hollings stared in wonder. "No," he said. She remembered. He reached forward, trembling, and brushed the dust from the amulet. For an instant, the air shimmered, the faint hum returning, and in it, faint but clear, came a whisper that seemed to rise from the very stone. "Arthur Wynne." Hollings froze. His mouth went dry. "What did you say?" he whispered. But the chamber had fallen silent again. Only the torchlight moved, flickering across the still, serene face of the mummy. Yusuf stared at him, wide-eyed. What name did she speak? Hollings did not answer. He could not. The mummy had whispered, not the name of a queen, but the name of the man who had vanished seeking her. And in that moment, he knew that Alistair Wynne had never left the tomb. The desert remembers. The dead do not sleep. Visions of the past. When night fell upon the valley once more, the stars burned strangely low, as though the heavens had drawn closer to watch what transpired below. The desert seemed to shimmer with a faint luminescence, an almost imperceptible gleam in the grains of sand, not quite moonlight, but something older, something drawn up from beneath the earth itself. Professor Arthur Hollings sat alone by the entrance to the tomb, the fire before him dying to embers. Around him the camp was quiet. Yusuf had long since fallen asleep, though even in slumber the young man's body twitched, haunted by dreams. The wind had dropped away entirely, leaving behind a stillness so profound that Hollings could hear the faint ticking of his own pocket watch. He had not been able to close his eyes since the discovery. The image of the mummy, the whisper of that impossible voice, lingered in his mind with dreadful clarity. He told himself it was imagination, that the whisper was an echo, a trick of acoustics, the mind translating vibration into speech, but the thought rang hollow. He had heard his name. The voice had not called him Arthur Hollings. It had spoken the name Arthur Wynne. Wynne, his mentor. Wynne, who had vanished in this very place nearly 2 decades ago. Hollings turned the brass compass over in his hand. Its surface was warm, though the night air was cold. The initials A, W, glimmered faintly in the firelight, and for a moment he imagined that it pulsed, slow, deliberate, as though it still beat with the rhythm of a human heart. He exhaled sharply and rose. He could not sit idle any longer. Something in the tomb had awoken, not a spirit perhaps, but a memory, vast and insistent, pressing against the edges of the present. He felt it in his bones, a weight behind every breath, a vibration beneath every thought. He lifted a lantern and descended once more into the earth. The passage felt different now. The air that had once been cool and still seemed to tremble faintly, carrying with it the scent of incense and burnt oil. His footsteps echoed softly along the sloping stone, though he could not tell if the echoes belonged to him or to someone unseen walking beside him. The murals on the walls, half faded and cracked, seemed almost to shimmer as he passed, their colours deepening as if warmed by his presence. When he entered the burial chamber, the torches flared of their own accord. The light swam across the polished walls, reflecting from the gold inlay and catching on the faint shimmer of dust that hung in the air. The sarcophagus stood open, the mummy within still untouched. The wrappings lay smooth and perfect, as though time itself hesitated to unravel them. He approached slowly, each step sounding impossibly loud in the tomb's hush. The air grew heavy, pressing against his chest. He reached out, not quite touching the edge of the sarcophagus, and whispered, "Neferet." The moment the name left his lips, the light changed. The torches dimmed to a deep amber glow, and the air thickened with a warmth that was not of this world. The murals on the walls seemed to stir, their painted figures shifting in the half-light. And then softly, like the drawing of breath, the sound began again, a hum rising from the stone, deep and resonant, pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. The world tilted. Suddenly, he was no longer standing in the tomb. He stood beneath a sky of molten gold, the air rich with the scent of lotus and frankincense. Before him stretched a vast city of gleaming limestone Thebes, alive and radiant, its temples unbroken, its streets filled with the murmur of thousands of voices. The Nile shimmered like a ribbon of liquid fire beneath the setting sunday. Drums beat softly in the distance. He looked down at himself, his hands, his body, and found that he was clothed in linen robes, the fabric embroidered with symbols of the Sunday. His skin was darker, his hands stronger. In his grasp he held a bronze staff engraved with hieroglyphs he could not read yet somehow understood. He heard a voice behind him, calm, low, commanding. "The hour has come." He turned. A woman approached, veiled in white, her movements graceful, deliberate. Around her, attendants bowed low, their faces hidden. She moved through them like moonlight through water. When she reached him, she lifted the veil. It was her Neferet. Her face was not the serene mask of the mummy, nor the sorrowful image from the murals, but alive, vivid, filled with light. Her eyes were dark and deep, her lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. There was beauty in her, yes, but also power, a stillness that made the air around her hum. "You have come as I foresaw," she said. Hollings tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. "Who am I?" "You are the witness," she replied, "as you were before, and will be again. You have followed my memory through time." She reached out, touching his brow lightly with her fingertips. At her touch, images flooded his mind, temples rising, stars aligning, priests chanting in torchlight. He saw her standing before a vast altar, her arms raised toward the heavens as the people knelt behind her. A voice, not hers but something greater, filled the air, a word that was not a word but pure resonance, a sound that vibrated through every living thing, making the earth tremble. Then came the priests, terrified, desperate, seizing her arms, binding her in linen, sealing her mouth with gold. He saw the tears that streaked her face as they carried her into the darkness, her eyes fixed on the stars above the tomb's opening. "They feared the truth," she whispered beside him now. "The gods they served were born of the word I spoke. To utter it again would unmake them." "Then why speak it?" Hollings asked. "Because the world is asleep," she said. "It dreams of walls and masters, of gods who rule rather than remember. I would wake it." The vision wavered, shifting like mist. He was in the tomb again, standing beside the open sarcophagus. The wrappings of the mummy fluttered faintly, as if stirred by breath. The air shimmered. "You hear me now, as wind did," her voice murmured. He listened but did not understand. He became my echo. "You too are chosen to remember." Hollings staggered back, shaking his head. "No, I'm not him. I won't." "You already are," she said. Her form glowed brighter, the golden light filling the chamber. He saw shapes moving within it, scenes flashing in rapid succession, wind descending into the tomb, his face illuminated by torchlight. the mirrors rippling with her reflection, his hand touching the glass, his body dissolving into light. Then the same scene again, but this time it was Hollings standing there, his own reflection bending into hers. The hum deepened, the air vibrating, until it became impossible to tell where his heartbeat ended and the sound began. The light pressed against him, surrounding him, entering him. He gasped, falling to his knees. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing that is not already yours," she whispered. "To remember is to awaken. Speak what was silenced." Her face was inches from his now, her eyes filled with that same ancient sorrow. Her lips moved, forming a soundless word. He tried to hear it strained, reached, but as before, it slipped from his memory even as it entered it. Only the feeling remained. Warmth, light, the weight of eternity. When he opened his eyes, the vision had vanished. The torches had burned low. The sarcophagus was closed once more, the chamber silent. Yet his heart still beat to that rhythm, that pulse that had no beginning or end. He stumbled back up the passage, the light of his lantern swinging wildly. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the cliffs. Yusuf stirred from his sleep, blinking at the sight of his ashen-faced mentor. "Professor," he said, rising quickly. "Are you hurt?" Hollings shook his head. His voice was quiet, distant. "She showed me everything." Yusuf frowned. "Who?" "Neferet." The young man froze. "Sir, you've been dreaming." "Perhaps," Hollings murmured, staring toward the horizon where the sun now burned red and vast. "But dreams are how memory survives." That day he said nothing more, but as the sun climbed, Yusuf noticed something strange. Wherever Hollings stood, the air seemed to shimmer faintly around him, like heat over sand, and when he listened closely, he thought he heard far beneath the wind a low, rhythmic hum, as though the desert itself breathed in time with the man who had seen too much. That night, when Yusuf returned to the tomb to lock it for the evening, he paused beside the sarcophagus. The mummy lay still beneath its wrappings, the amulet of gold resting upon her chest, but in the flicker of his lantern he thought he saw the faintest movement, the rise and fall of breath. He leaned closer, holding the light near the face. For a heartbeat, the air stirred, and then he heard it so faint he might have imagined it a whisper rising from the darkness between the wrappings. "Arthur." The lantern slipped from his hand, crashing to the floor. The flame flared, then died. In the silence that followed, Yusuf's heart pounded so loudly he could hear nothing else. When he fled the tomb and looked back toward the cliffs, the night wind had risen. It carried with it a sound like distant music, soft, unearthly, and full of longing. The desert had begun to dream again, and in its dreaming, the voices of the past were no longer silent. The Temple of Shadows. By the next morning, the camp was in disarray. Yusuf had not slept. His lantern had shattered upon the stone floor, and his nerves trembled as though the desert itself had entered his veins. The others noticed the change in him, the haunted eyes, the hands that would not steady even when he tried to write his notes. Professor Hollings said little. He moved with a strange composure, as if some invisible rhythm guided him. He spoke rarely, ate little, and spent most of the daylight hours seated near the tomb's entrance, sketching diagrams that made no sense to anyone else. Circles within circles, lines like the paths of stars, strange sigils that looked almost like the old hieroglyphs, but not quite. Sometimes Yusuf caught him murmuring under his breath. Not English, nor Arabic, nor any tongue he recognized. The words seemed to hum as he spoke them, reverberating in the air, words that made the sand shift slightly at his feet. Yusuf stopped asking questions after the second day. The valley itself seemed altered. The color of the cliffs had darkened subtly, their faces gleaming with a faint oily sheen in the sunlight. The wind no longer moved at random, but rose and fell in regular intervals, like a pulse. At night, the stars appeared distorted, their reflections in the black sky quivering as though stirred by unseen water. It was on the third evening, just as the horizon began to bleed red, that Hollings called Yusuf over. "Do you hear it?" he asked quietly. Yusuf frowned. "Hear what, sir?" Hollings pointed toward the cliff face where the tomb mouth yawned like an open wound. A sound drifted from within, faint, rhythmic, almost musical. It pulsed in slow waves, the same deep vibration they had heard on the first night. But now it carried a tone, a melody too precise to be natural. "She's calling," Hollings said, his voice hushed with awe. "Not just from the tomb from beneath it. There's more, Yusuf. The burial chamber is not the end. It's the threshold." Yusuf shivered. A threshold to what? Hollings smiled faintly. "To her temple, the one that predates the pyramids, hidden under the valley." Wynne was right. The tomb is only a doorway. Before Yusuf could protest, Hollings was already gathering equipment, ropes, lanterns, chisels, and a small phonograph recorder. "We'll document everything," he said briskly. "History buried her once. It will not do so again." By the time the last light faded from the desert, they were standing once more in the chamber of the forgotten queen. The air was cold, heavy with a perfume that grew stronger the deeper they went. Frankincense and something floral, like the scent of lilies long dead. The walls seemed to glisten faintly as if wet, though the air was utterly dry. At the base of the sarcophagus, Hollings knelt and began clearing away debris from the floor. "Here," he murmured, tracing the stone with his fingers. "Do you see this seam? It's the same spiral pattern Wynne described in his notes. The lotus surrounded by serpents, a symbol of rebirth. But it's solid stone," Yusuf protested. "Not stone," Hollings said, eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "A lid. They've relotiki wansuri." He pried at the seam with his trowel, and as before, the ground responded. A low groan reverberated through the chamber. The tiles shifted, sliding aside with eerie smoothness, revealing a dark shaft descending into shadow. The smell of incense thickened, mingled now with a strange metallic tang. Yusuf hesitated at the edge, gripping the rope. "Professor, we shouldn't." But Hollings was already lowering himself down. "The tomb was a veil," he called up. "This is the truth." The descent was steep, the air dense and close. The light from their torches seemed to bend around the walls rather than illuminate them. The shaft opened at last into a vast space that neither could fully see, a chamber so large their footsteps echoed into eternity. The floor beneath them was black, smooth, perfectly polished, reflecting their light as if it were water. Then, as the torches flared brighter, the shadows withdrew, revealing the temple. It was not built like the tombs of pharaohs. Its pillars were carved from dark stone, shot through with veins of gold, spiraling upward in shapes that resembled twisting reeds. The walls were covered in reliefs, but these were unlike anything in Egyptian art. The figures were elongated, fluid, their forms merging with stars, rivers, wings, human and divine fused together, as though the sculptors had sought to depict transformation itself. At the far end stood a colossal statue, 10 times the height of a man, carved from obsidian so black it seemed to absorb light. The statue was of Neferet, but here she was not serene, not veiled, not bound. She stood upright, her head crowned with the disk of the sun framed by serpents, her arms raised as if commanding the heavens. Around her, smaller figures knelt, kings, priests, gods, their faces turned toward her in worship. Yusuf's breath caught. "This cannot be real," he whispered. "It's too ancient. The style, it's older than the Old Kingdom itself." Hollings nodded slowly. "Older than memory," he murmured. "Older than the first language." He moved forward, his footsteps echoing hollowly in the silence. The air was cold yet charged, as if filled with invisible currents. When he reached the base of the statue, he saw an altar carved into the floor, a perfect circle of red stone, inlaid with symbols that seemed to shimmer like molten metal. At its center lay a single object, a small mirror of polished bronze. He picked it up. The metal was warm to the touch. When he held it to the torchlight, his reflection stared back, but behind it, faintly visible, was another face, hers. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged. "Professor?" Yusuf's voice trembled. "What do you see?" Hollings didn't answer. His eyes widened as the hum began again, louder now, filling the chamber, making the air vibrate until dust rained from the ceiling. The light from the torches flickered wildly. The mirror grew hot in his hand. "You have come where they buried my voice." The whisper filled his mind, clear, and soft. "This is the house they built to contain my word, but the word does not sleep." He staggered backward, clutching his head. The mirror slipped from his grasp and struck the floor, but instead of shattering, it melted into the stone, its surface rippling outward like water. The red circle of the altar began to glow, brightening to a deep, living scarlet. "Professor!" Yusuf shouted, seizing his arm. "We have to go." But Hollings only stared upward at the statue, his eyes reflecting its faint radiance. "She's awakening," he whispered. "Can't you feel it? The air it's breathing." And indeed, the air seemed to pulse. The walls expanded and contracted with each vibration, the carvings shifting subtly as though alive. The enormous statue of Neferet seemed to quiver, the black stone rippling with faint threads of gold that spread like veins through her arms and face. Then came the sound, low at first, then rising, a vast harmonic tone that resonated in the bones more than the ears. The torches flared blue, the reflection of the statue's eyes caught the light, and then, impossibly, opened. They glowed with the colour of dawn. "The word returns," said the voice, not aloud, but inside both their minds. One spoke it, and was forgotten. Another remembers, and now the silence ends. The light filled the temple, brilliant and blinding. Yusuf fell to his knees, covering his face. Hollings stood motionless, arms at his sides, his expression one of rapture and terror. "Who are you?" he gasped. "I am the voice they feared, the breath between life and death, the sound of remembrance." As she spoke, the statue's lips moved not as stone but as flesh. The air trembled with her words, and the black floor rippled like a lake beneath their feet. Yusuf scrambled backward, shouting prayers, his voice lost in the growing roar. Hollings did not move. He stood before the living statue of Neferet, eyes wide, lips parted as though trying to speak. "Say it," the voice whispered, "the word that unites all things." He tried the syllables forming in his throat, strange and heavy. The air burned. Yusuf lunged forward, grabbing him by the shoulder, pulling him back. The contact broke the trance. Hollings gasped, collapsing to his knees. The glow dimmed slightly, and the great statue stilled once more. The hum faded to a faint vibration, echoing deep below. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Hollings lifted his head, sweat glistening on his brow. "She was waiting," he whispered. "All these centuries waiting for someone to speak the word again." Yusuf stared at him. "You would have died." "No," Hollings said, his voice distant. "Not died. Changed." They climbed back to the surface in silence. The dawn was breaking, pale and cold. The desert stretched before them, quiet, endless, alive. When they reached the camp, Hollings turned once more toward the tomb. In the morning light, the entrance seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the stone itself were breathing. "She isn't gone," he said softly. "She was never gone." And somewhere far below, deep in the heart of the Temple of Shadows, a faint hum began again, soft, patient, eternal, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, the astral alignment. For several days after their descent into the Temple of Shadows, Hollings and Yusuf spoke little. They worked in silence, as though words themselves might awaken something best left dreaming. The valley was unnaturally still. The desert wind had vanished, and each dawn rose without sound. The air dense and pale like breath held too long. Even the sun seemed slower, hesitant to climb the sky. At night, the stars blazed in strange formations, their reflections trembling across the black cliffs. It was as though the heavens themselves had shifted their rhythm to watch the men below. Hollings spent his time poring over his sketches and notes, tracing the spirals and circles he had drawn inside the temple. He slept only in fragments, waking with new calculations scrawled across scraps of paper. Yusuf grew increasingly uneasy. He saw his mentor standing for hours at the mouth of the tomb, eyes fixed upon the horizon, as though waiting for something only he could see. On the fifth evening, Hollings beckoned him over. "Look at the sky," he said softly. The sun had barely set, and the first stars were kindling in the indigo dusk. One burned brighter than the rest, low on the eastern horizon, white and unwavering. "Sirius," Yusuf murmured. The star of Isis. Hollings nodded. The same star that guided the flood of the Nile. The same that the ancients used to mark the turning of time. He spread a sheet of parchment before them, covered in diagrams. I've measured the orientation of the temple. Its central axis points directly to the rising of Sirius, not the position it holds today, but where it appeared 4,000 years ago. The entire tomb was built for this alignment, to capture the moment when the star ascends. He tapped a circle at the center of the drawing, the altar beneath the statue of Neferet. When the light of Sirius enters the temple through the shaft above, it falls upon this point. Once every 1,000 years, the star returns to the same position. Tomorrow night, it will rise again. Yusuf's breath caught. You mean to say this awakening was designed to happen? Hollings smiled faintly, his eyes fever-bright. Not awakening, remembrance. The Egyptians believed Sirius marked the rebirth of the soul, the gate through which the gods return to the world. Neferet must have known the secret of that passage. Her temple is not a tomb, it's an instrument, a bridge between heaven and earth. He stood, his shadow stretching long in the moonlight. Wind's notes hinted at it. The inverted feather of Ma'at, not a symbol of heresy, but inversion, reflection, the balance between truth and silence. She was not cursed for blasphemy. She was punished for understanding the pattern. Yusuf frowned. Pattern? The alignment of sound and light, Hollings said, voice hushed with awe. The word she spoke, it wasn't mere language. It was resonance, a frequency that mirrored the vibration of the cosmos itself. That's why the walls hum. They're built to echo it. The temple is a tuning chamber, one that awakens only when the heavens align. Yusuf stepped back. You speak as if she meant to return. Hollings looked at him, and for a moment Yusuf thought he saw a glimmer of gold in the professor's eyes. Perhaps she never left. That night, Hollings worked by lamplight, his compass and notebook spread before him. He traced lines between stars, recalculating the rising angles. His hands trembled with excitement. Yusuf tried to sleep, but was haunted by dreams of the temple submerged in starlight, of a woman's voice whispering beneath the sound of flowing water, of the desert itself shifting like a living thing. When dawn came, Hollings was already awake. He stood at the tomb's entrance, the wind tugging at his coat, his eyes fixed upon the horizon. Tonight, he said quietly, the star will reach its zenith. We must be inside when it happens. Yusuf hesitated. Professor, after what we saw, Hollings turned to him sharply. Do you think I fear her? She sought understanding, not vengeance. The priests twisted her memory because they could not comprehend her truth. Don't you see, Yusuf? She was the first astronomer, the first physicist. Her word was the universe itself. Yusuf's mouth was dry. And if speaking it again brings ruin, then let ruin come, Hollings said simply. Better ruin than forgetting. But Fain's a creed R and D8K, the A fire out weekon. As night fell, they descended once more into the earth. The air inside the tomb was colder than before, sharp and metallic like the breath of deep caves. The torches burned low, their flames bending in invisible currents. Hollings led the way down the spiral shaft to the great temple. When they entered, the walls were alive, with faint light, the golden veins within the stone pulsing slowly, as though the structure itself was waking. The statue of Neferet loomed above them, her obsidian face gleaming in the torchlight. At her feet, the altar shimmered faintly, the red stone now translucent, glowing from within like a heart of ember. The alignment is beginning, Hollings murmured. Do you feel it? Yusuf did. The air had changed. It vibrated softly, a sound too low to hear but strong enough to feel in his chest. The hum grew deeper, rising from the floor, threading through the walls, the ceiling, the air itself. Above them, through a narrow shaft carved in the rock, a single beam of starlight appeared, a line of silver cutting through the darkness. It fell perfectly upon the altar. The glow deepened, the red stone brightened to gold, then white, until the light filled the temple. The hum swelled, merging with the faint sound of wind or perhaps breath rising from the earth. Then, in the center of the altar, the air shimmered. A shape began to form, faint, translucent, like smoke twisting in slow motion. It coalesced into the outline of a woman. Her form was draped in linen that glowed with the same light as the star above. Her face was serene, her eyes bright and infinite. "The cycle turns," she said. Her voice was not sound but vibration, a resonance that spoke directly into their bones. "The star returns, and with it, the breath of the world." Yusuf fell to his knees, trembling. Hollings stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Neferet," he whispered. The figure inclined her head. "You remembered my name, and so I remember you." "What's-he?" Hollings stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Why us? Why now?" "Because the silence has lasted too long," she replied. "The word must be spoken again, or the world will forget what it is to be alive." The hum intensified, the pillars trembled, dust falling like mist. Above, through the shaft, the star blazed brighter, casting silver fire across the chamber. "The heavens and the earth mirror one another," she continued. "When they align, memory and time meet. I built this place so the world would remember its own beginning." Her gaze turned to Hollings. "You have carried my voice across centuries. You are my echo. Speak what I cannot." He stared at her, his throat dry. "I don't know the word." "You do," she said. "It sleeps in your blood, as it slept in his." The light flared, filling his vision. He saw images, Wynne's face illuminated by torchlight, his hand touching the glass, the moment the tomb had sealed itself, then his own reflection, his own hand mirroring the same motion. Two men divided by time, united by memory. The air shook. Hollings felt the vibration rise in his chest, a sound forming not in his ears but in his bones. The word, or something like it, trembled on his lips. He opened his mouth. "Professor, stop!" Yusuf cried, seizing his arm. The sound broke. The light dimmed, the vibration faltered. The apparition flickered, her gaze softening. "Not yet," she whispered. "The world is not ready. The word must sleep once more." Her form began to fade, dissolving into dust and light. "Wait," Hollings shouted. "What happens when it's spoken?" Her voice was a sigh, fading into the hum. "When it is spoken, all things will remember their name, even the gods." Then she was gone. The light collapsed. The hum fell silent. The temple was dark once more. For a long time, neither man moved. Then Yusuf whispered, "We should leave this place." Hollings nodded slowly. "Yes, but it will not leave us." When they climbed back to the surface, the stars were fading. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and cold. Hollings turned once more to the east, where Sirius still glimmered faintly. He spoke softly, as if to the desert itself. "She's not gone. She's waiting for the next alignment." And far below, in the darkness of the temple, the red stone of the altar pulsed once faintly, like a heartbeat before falling still. The cycle of remembrance had begun again. The scribe's confession. In the weeks that followed, the valley grew quieter, still not with the peace of emptiness, but the hush of something listening. Each dawn broke paler than the last, as though the desert itself had grown weary of light. The wind had long since ceased its wandering song, and when it did stir, it came only in faint rhythmic sighs that seemed to echo the low hum now pulsing faintly from the tomb beneath their feet. Yusuf tried to convince himself that the sound came from the shifting of the earth, from air trapped in hidden fissures, but each night it grew more deliberate, like a heartbeat rising from the stone. Hollings spent those nights inside the tomb. He descended alone now, lantern in hand, staying for hours, sometimes until dawn. Yusuf would watch from the camp above, pacing by the fire, his heart tightening each time the wind shifted, afraid that the sound carried words he should not hear. When the professor returned at last, his eyes gleamed with the dull fire of exhaustion and revelation. His hands trembled, not with fear but with awe, as though he had touched something divine and barely survived the contact. "She left writings," Hollings said one morning, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Not on papyrus on the walls of the temple itself. They were hidden under a layer of soot and resin. When the starlight entered the chamber, the surface of the stone changed. It revealed text invisible to the naked eye. Hieratic script, interwoven with symbols I've never seen before. It's astonishing." Yusuf looked at him warily. "And what do they say?" Hollings smiled faintly. Confession. A story written by her scribe, the one who sealed her tomb. He unrolled a small parchment filled with sketches, each one drawn in meticulous detail. Listen. His voice softened, almost reverent, as he began to read from his translation. In the 43rd year of the reign of the living sun, I, Tameru, the servant of the word, was commanded to record the truth that none shall ever speak. The Lady Neferet, she of the hidden name, spoke before the priests and revealed what was forbidden, that the gods were but echoes of the first sound, and that sound itself was life. Her words bent the air and made the lamps burn blue. The high priests trembled, for they knew her voice touched the secret heart of the world. Hollings looked up. Do you see what this means? It wasn't metaphor. She discovered a resonance, a vibration that bridged spirit and matter. To them, it was heresy. To us, it is physics. Yusuf frowned, uneasy. You speak of her as though she were a scientist. In her own way, she was. Listen further. He returned to the translation, his voice lowering as though he feared the desert itself might overhear. They came to her in secret, the keepers of the law, and begged her to unsay the word. But she smiled and said that silence is not the absence of sound, but its echo turned inward. So they sealed her mouth with gold and bound her within stone, believing the word would perish with her breath. Yet as we closed the door, I heard her whisper once more, and the walls trembled. The others fled, but I wrote her words that they might be remembered when time forgets. Hollings fell silent. The wind stirred faintly, brushing the edge of the tent. She wasn't cursed, he said after a moment. She was silenced by fear. The priests sealed her alive. They knew she had touched something beyond their understanding. They built the temple to contain her, but the structure was designed not to imprison her, but to preserve the word until the heavens realigned. She planned it, every measurement, every carving, all leading to this. Yusuf shook his head slowly. You sound as if you worship her. Worship? Hollings smiled, but there was no humor in it. No, my boy, I revere her. There's a difference. She wasn't divine, she was awake. And if we can decode the pattern she left, perhaps we can awaken too. He reached for another sheet of notes, scrawled with lines of translation. Here, he said, the final entry of the scribe. His voice softened again as he read. In the last hour before dawn, the queen spoke to me through the stone. Her voice was soft, as when the river breathes in sleep. She said, Do not fear the silence, Tameru. It is the breath between worlds. I go now to the place where sound is born. When the star returns, I shall rise in remembrance, and you who write my words will walk beside me, even after your bones are dust. Hollings let the paper fall. The tent was silent save for the faint rasp of his breath. She promised her scribe immortality, Yusuf murmured. Not immortality, Hollings corrected gently. Continuance, the preservation of memory through time. Her scribe wrote these words, and now we read them. Don't you see? We are the continuation of his task. The memory is alive because we speak it. Yusuf hesitated. And if speaking it wakes something that should not wake, the Symblide is sold. Then we'll know, Hollings said simply. That night, he returned to the temple again, leaving Yusuf above to watch the stars. The desert was silent, save for the faint hum that never ceased. It came now in patterns waves that rose and fell like breathing. Yusuf sat beside the dying fire, the professor's translations open in his lap, and traced the hieroglyphs with trembling fingers. As he read the scribe's words aloud under his breath, the air stirred faintly, and a single grain of sand rolled across the page. He looked up sharply, heart pounding. The hum had changed. It was no longer distant. It came from beneath him, from the very ground, resonating through the sand in steady rhythm. A voice rose softly in the dark, not human, not entirely sound. Tameru. Yusuf froze. The fire hissed, guttering out. The desert was swallowed by blackness. The one who writes hears again. He stumbled to his feet, his pulse racing. The sound came from everywhere, from the cliffs, from the dunes, from within his own chest. It was not a voice, not in any language he knew, but he understood it. It was memory itself, speaking. He clutched the papers and ran toward the tomb entrance. "Professor!" he called, his voice cracking. "She's speaking again." Inside the temple, Hollings stood before the statue of Neferet. The light of his torch flickered across her face, illuminating the faint veins of gold that now seemed to shimmer beneath the surface. He did not turn as Yusuf entered. "She never stopped speaking," Hollings said quietly. "You're only just beginning to hear her." He lifted his lantern higher. The inscription around the altar, once faint and indecipherable, now glowed faintly, lines of golden light threading through the stone. The hieroglyphs pulsed in rhythm with the hum, their symbols shimmering as though alive. "She's rewriting herself," Hollings whispered. "The temple is her body. The stone is her skin." Yusuf's voice trembled. "We must leave, Professor. This is not for us." But Hollings only smiled, eyes bright with something beyond reason. "You sound like the priests of old." He reached out and placed his palm upon the altar. The light surged, the air convulsed. A sound filled the chamber, not loud, but absolute, a tone that resonated so deeply it seemed to shake the marrow of the world. Yusuf was thrown backward, the papers scattering from his grasp. For an instant, the temple was filled with blinding white light, and in it he saw, or thought he saw, Neferet standing beside Hollings, her hand upon his shoulder, her lips moving, as though whispering the word once more. Then the light vanished. Hollings stood motionless, his face serene, his eyes closed. The glow within the stone faded to a faint ember. "Professor," Yusuf whispered. Hollings opened his eyes. They gleamed with faint gold. "She showed me," he said softly, "the truth of the word." "What did she say?" He smiled faintly. "It cannot be said, only remembered." Outside, the wind returned at last, carrying with it the low, unending hum that now pulsed through the desert like a second heartbeat. That night, Yusuf dreamt of the scribe Tamaru, sitting by lamplight as he etched Neferet's words onto the walls. The scribe's eyes were his own. His hand trembled in the same way, and when he looked up, Neferet stood behind him, her voice soft as the sand. "You will write again." When he awoke, the dawn was rising over the dunes, and from beneath the earth came a sound steady, rhythmic, alive, the sound of something vast remembering itself. The confession was complete, and the silence had begun to speak. The name remembered. The days that followed blurred into one long, fevered silence. It was not the stillness of peace, but of anticipation, a vast breath drawn in before the universe dared exhale. The valley had become a thing apart from the living world. The air trembled faintly, not from wind, but from the low vibration that pulsed continuously beneath the ground. Even the animals had fled. No bird shadowed the cliffs. No scorpion crept across the sand. The desert had become aware of itself, awake and waiting. Yusuf no longer marked the days. Sleep came in fractured moments, filled with dreams that dissolved into waking visions. He would open his eyes and find himself back in the temple, staring at the great statue of Neferet, her eyes closed but glowing faintly as though dreaming her own dream. Then he would blink, and he'd be in the camp again, the fire burned down to ash, the professor sitting beside the tomb entrance, motionless, face pale as stone. Hollings had stopped speaking in any language Yusuf understood. He murmured to himself in rhythmic tones, a melodic cadence that rose and fell like chant. Sometimes the very air around him would shimmer as he spoke, as though it responded. When Yusuf begged him to stop, Hollings only smiled gently, the golden light faint in his eyes. "She's remembering herself," he said one morning, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not possession, Yusuf, it's resonance. She's not within me, she's through me. The word is aligning. I-A-S-P-tings of Taif." "The word," Yusuf repeated, trembling. "You mean the word that unmade her?" Hollings turned to him. His expression was one of quiet wonder, not madness. "It didn't unmake her, it changed her. The priests thought she had died, but she was transfigured. Her body became silence, her voice became stone. The temple is her memory, and now, because we have spoken her name, the memory awakens." He looked out across the dunes, eyes distant. "Tonight, the star reaches its highest ascent. When it passes overhead, the light will fall through the shaft again. The cycle will complete." Yusuf swallowed hard. "And then what happens?" Hollings smiled faintly. "Then she speaks once more, and perhaps the world will remember what it has forgotten. This is 180, 80, 80, and Septivia, and felled with miles, and feltumed, and feltumed, and felt miles, and feltumed, and feltum, and feltum, and feltum." That evening, as the last light of the sun vanished, the desert turned to liquid silver beneath the rising stars. The night was unnaturally clear, the constellations sharp, almost burning. Sirius gleamed just above the horizon, brighter than any other, its light piercing through the stillness, like the eye of eternity. Yusuf followed Hollings into the tomb one last time. He felt no courage, only resignation, as though the act were part of something inevitable, older than choice. The air within was colder than it had ever been, though his skin prickled with heat. Each step downward echoed softly, fading too quickly, as though the stone swallowed the sound. When they reached the temple, the torches refused to burn, yet light filled the chamber, a soft, steady glow radiating from the veins of gold that threaded through the black stone. The great statue of Neferet towered above them, her face calm, her hands raised as though in benediction. The altar beneath her pulsed with faint crimson light, steady as a heartbeat. The hum had grown louder, resonating deep in the bones. It was not a sound, but a force, ancient, immense, compassionate, terrible. Hollings approached the altar. His voice was steady, serene. "She's here." Yusuf could not speak. His throat had gone dry. Then the beam appeared, a single shaft of starlight descending through the narrow opening above, striking the center of the altar with perfect precision. The red stone blazed white, filling the chamber with living fire. The hum swelled. The walls began to shimmer, the carvings moving, reshaping themselves, hieroglyphs becoming waves, waves becoming stars, stars coalescing into faces that watched, that remembered. And then she stood there, Neferet, not the spectral image of before, nor the faint outline glimpsed in the mirror, but living radiant, formed of light and shadow intertwined. Her linen robes glowed like molten pearl, and her eyes held the calm of deep water. When she spoke, her voice carried not through the air, but through every living atom of the temple. "The name returns." Hollings fell to his knees, tears glinting in the light. "Your name will never be forgotten again," he whispered. "It was never lost," she said gently, "only silenced. Memory is not bound by death." She turned her gaze toward Yusuf, and for a moment he felt the weight of her attention, not cruel, not divine, but immeasurably vast. In that instant he saw her life, the palace at dawn, the golden river, the priests kneeling before her. The moment her voice broke the air and filled the heavens, he saw the fear in their eyes, the sealing of the tomb, the centuries of silence that followed, and he understood. She had not sought to defy the gods. She had sought to remind them and humanity that they were the same. Hollings rose slowly, his face aglow with reverence. "Tell me the word," he said softly. "Let me speak it. Let the world remember." Neferet looked at him with sadness that stretched across ages. "To speak it is to unmake it," she said. "It is not for lips of flesh. It can only be known. I tad most and nigh." Hollings reached toward her, his fingers trembling. "Then show me." She touched his forehead. The chamber erupted in light. The air became liquid fire. Yusuf cried out, shielding his face. For a moment, he saw both of them, Neferet and Hollings, surrounded by swirling gold, their forms merging, dissolving into one another like sunlight upon water. The hum deepened, vibrating so powerfully that the ground itself seemed to breathe. The light poured upward through the shaft, flaring into the night sky. Outside, the desert blazed with white radiance. The dunes glowed, every grain of sand shimmering, as though remembering what it had once been, the dust of stars. Then, slowly, the light faded. The hum softened, fading into silence once more. Yusuf opened his eyes. The temple was dark again. The statue of Neferet stood still, serene, but now her face was different. Her eyes, once closed, were open, gazing softly down at the altar. Of Hollings, there was no sign. The air was cool, still, heavy with the scent of myrrh. Yusuf fell to his knees. "Professor," he whispered. Only silence answered, but in that silence, a warmth touched his mind, not a voice, not words, but memory. He saw the professor standing beside Neferet, his face calm, his eyes filled with light. He heard her whisper to him, "You are not lost. You are remembered. Nod, dua, die, regrai." When he climbed to the surface, the sky was changing. The dawn was brighter than any he had ever seen, the sun rising as though newly born. The air shimmered with color. The desert stretched before him, vast and alive. He turned back to the tomb. The entrance had sealed itself again, smooth and perfect, the symbols of the feather and the serpent glowing faintly before fading into stone. He stood there for a long time, the silence pressing gently against his ears, until at last he whispered, "Neferet." The name drifted out across the sands, caught by the wind, and somewhere, faintly, the desert replied, "Remember." That day, Yusuf left the valley. He never returned. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the stars burned low and Sirius rose once more over the horizon, he would feel the faintest tremor beneath his feet, a heartbeat in the earth, and he would know that beneath the sand, the queen who had spoken the first word still dreamed, her memory alive in the pulse of the world. And though the temples crumbled, though the scholars forgot, though centuries passed and empires fell, the hum never ceased. It lived in the wind that crossed the dunes, in the whisper of the Nile, in the breath of every living thing, because once, long ago, a woman had spoken her name and the world had listened. The desert remembers. Years slipped away like wind-blown sand. The valley where the tomb of Neferet lay hidden once more returned to silence, the kind of silence that is not absence, but memory. The dunes shifted, swallowing the remnants of tents and tools, the outlines of a camp long deserted. Each storm erased a little more, until the land was once again what it had always been, vast, untouched, eternal. Yet beneath its surface, something remained awake. In Cairo, Yusuf grew old. The world beyond the desert had changed. Radios crackled in every cafe, airplanes carved the sky, the river carried ships larger than the palaces of the pharaohs. Yet sometimes, amid the hum of the modern city, he would hear it a tone too low for any instrument, a hum that trembled faintly through glass and bone alike. The first time it came, he was sitting by the window of his small apartment, the sun setting over the city, when the vibration rolled through the air like the breath of the earth itself. It was faint, rhythmic, patient, the same pulse he had heard in the valley. He had told no one of what had happened there. Not the antiquities department, not the scholars who still sent him letters asking for details about Hollings's final expedition. He had said only that the professor was lost in a sand collapse, a tragedy, yes, but not unheard of. He never mentioned the statue whose eyes had opened, or the light that had filled the heavens. Those memories belonged to the desert, not to history. And yet history, like the desert, remembers in its own way. Each year, when Sirius rose again over the eastern horizon, Yusuf would feel a pressure in his chest, a stirring of something vast and ancient that no time could diminish. On those nights, the world felt different, the air sharper, the stars nearer, the Nile whispering like a voice half-remembered. He would dream of the temple then not in ruin, but whole, radiant, its obsidian pillars gleaming beneath the starlight, the statue of Neferet watching with eyes of molten gold. In those dreams, he always heard her say the same thing, "I am not gone, I am the memory of the world." One such night, late in his life, Yusuf found himself walking through the streets of Cairo long after midnight. The air was still and clear. He followed the sound, that faint vibration, through the winding alleys, past the market stalls and the sleeping courtyards, until he reached the riverbank. There the Nile gleamed like black silk beneath the stars, its surface rippling with light. The hum grew stronger. He knelt, touching the water with trembling fingers. It was warm, impossibly warm for the hour. The vibration pulsed through it, through him, and suddenly he saw it, the reflection of the desert sky in the Nile's surface, and within it, the shimmer of 1,000 golden grains of sand moving as though alive. The memory of the valley was there, carried in the water the hum of the buried temple, the echo of Neferet's name whispered across centuries. He closed his eyes, and the world dissolved. He was back there, standing once more in the valley, though the dunes were higher now, the cliffs more eroded. The wind was singing again, a low, endless murmur that sounded almost like breathing. He felt no fear, only the strange calm of returning home. And then he saw her. Neferet stood upon the highest dune, her robes flowing like water, her hair the colour of midnight. She looked neither ghostly nor divine, now only human, ageless, radiant with quiet power. The sand swirled around her feet but did not touch her. She smiled, and Yusuf felt the years melt away. "You came back," she said softly. He bowed his head. "I never left. You carried the memory as I asked. You were the scribe, as he was before you." He hesitated. "Why me? Why any of us?" Her smile deepened, tinged with sadness. "Because the world forgets, and when it forgets, it falls asleep. Each age must have one who remembers the first word, the breath that began it all. The word is not spoken, Yusuf, it is lived." She stepped closer, and the air between them shimmered. "Do you know what the word truly is?" she asked. He shook his head. "It is not a name of gods, or power, or creation. It is love, the remembrance of being one with all things. The priests could not bear it, for love has no master. They silenced it, and called it blasphemy. But love is older than silence. It returns each time the stars align." Tears stung his eyes. "And Hollings? Wynne? Did they find you?" "They became what they sought," she said gently. "They are not lost. They are part of me now, as you will be." The sand around her began to rise, swirling in a slow, graceful spiral. Above, Sirius burned brighter than ever, its light cascading across the desert like molten silver. The hum filled the air again, vast, harmonious, unending. "The desert remembers," she whispered. "It holds the echo of every step, every breath. And when the time comes again, the world will wake." He felt the warmth of her hand upon his forehead, not flesh, not spirit, but something in between. The sound deepened, spreading outward, until it became everything: sky, sand, heartbeat, silence. And then there was peace. When morning came, the people of Cairo found Yusuf's body by the riverbank, his face turned toward the rising Sunday. He was smiling. They buried him near the water, beneath a small stone carved with no name, only the symbol of a feather pointing downward. Decades later, a team of archaeologists rediscovered the valley once more. Beneath the sand, they found remnants of walls so old they predated known Egyptian civilization. They found black stone polished to mirror brightness, and carvings of a woman standing between the sun and the stars. There was no inscription, only a faint hum that their instruments could not explain, a vibration that persisted even in silence. One of them, a young woman named Layla, lingered after the others had left. She pressed her palm against the stone, and for an instant she felt warmth, as if something deep beneath the surface had recognized her touch. She heard it then, faint and clear, a voice, soft as a sigh, whispering from the heart of the earth. "Remember." Layla's breath caught. She turned her face to the east, where Sirius was rising, and the wind began to sing again. The return of the light. The rediscovery of the valley stirred quiet wonder among scholars, but awakened something deeper in those who lingered there after sunset. The camp of Layla's expedition stood in the same hollow where Alistair Wynne had once pitched his tents, and later, where Hollings and Yusuf had traced the paths of forgotten stars. The air was no longer still. It shimmered with a barely perceptible rhythm, as though the earth itself pulsed in time with the heavens. During the day, the team worked with the precision of science, measuring, photographing, recording. But at night, when the desert cooled and the sky unfolded in its endless tapestry of stars, Layla would stand alone beside the exposed foundation stones, listening. There was a hum there, subtle, patient, unmistakable. She told herself it was seismic resonance, or wind vibrating through fissures in the rock. Yet sometimes, when the stars burned low, she thought she could hear words hidden inside the sound. Remember, breathe. Her colleagues laughed gently when she mentioned it. They said that solitude and exhaustion played tricks on the mind, that the desert was full of illusions, but deep down, she knew the sound was not of her imagination. It was older than imagination itself. One evening, as the heat faded and the first cool breath of night slid across the dunes, Layla walked to the edge of the excavation. The sky was unusually clear, the stars brilliant enough to cast shadows on the sand. Sirius had just risen, its light sharp and white, glinting like a blade of glass. For reasons she could not explain, she brought her notebook and a small handheld spectrometer, more from habit than purpose. She crouched beside the dark stone slab that marked the highest exposed layer of the buried temple. The stone was cold, but not lifeless. Beneath her palm she felt a faint vibration, steady, rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. She adjusted the device, aligning it toward the stone, and froze. The display flickered, then stabilized. A frequency. It pulsed at 432 Hz, the ancient tone the Egyptians once associated with harmony, the resonance of creation. Layla frowned. That number had been dismissed by modern science as a myth, yet here it was, humming beneath her skin. The hum grew stronger. Then, in a flash of intuition, she looked up. The shaft of stone they had uncovered, angled precisely toward the horizon, toward the place where Sirius now climbed. She recalled what Hollings had written in his lost notes, the ones found in the archives of the Institute. The temple is aligned to the rising of the star. When it reaches its zenith, the silence will speak again. Her pulse quickened. Could it be coincidence that they had uncovered the chamber so close to the same date recorded in Hollings's writings? Or had the desert itself chosen the moment? She whispered softly, "Neferet." The vibration deepened, as though the sound of her voice had been recognized. The air around her shimmered faintly, bending the starlight. She rose slowly to her feet, heart thundering. All across the excavation, the instruments began to react, seismographs quivering, recorders emitting faint static. The hum filled the air, spreading outward in waves that rippled through the sand like the breath of a sleeping giant. Layla stumbled back, overwhelmed. "What is this?" she whispered. The answer came not as sound, but as sensation, a warmth spreading through her chest, a whisper behind her heartbeat. "You have come in the appointed hour," she gasped. The voice was soft, feminine, distant yet intimate, like the memory of a dream. "You are the next witness." The ground shuddered gently. A swirl of sand lifted before her, moving not with the wind but with purpose, forming a spiral that glowed faintly in the starlight. The light of Sirius struck it, refracting in rainbow shards. Layla shielded her eyes. The spiral grew, expanding, unfolding downward into the earth, a vortex of light and dust. At its center, a shape began to form, translucent, shimmering. A woman. Her figure was both solid and ethereal, clothed in linen that moved as though underwater. Her hair cascaded in long dark waves, her eyes twin mirrors reflecting the stars above. She was beautiful beyond mortal measure, not because she seemed divine, but because she looked impossibly human, every movement filled with grace and grief. "Neferet," Layla breathed. The figure smiled faintly. "You speak my name without fear. Few remember it now." Layla trembled. "You're real. I am memory made light," said the voice, though her lips did not move. "I am the echo of the first word, preserved in the breath of the desert. You have uncovered what was never lost." "I don't understand," Layla whispered. "Why me? Why now?" "Because the world is forgetting again," Neferet said. "It drowns itself in noise, and yet it hears nothing. The balance falters. When the heavens align, someone must listen." The air vibrated with increasing intensity. The dunes around them shimmered, their outlines dissolving into waves of light. Above, the constellations appeared to move, converging around Sirius, which now blazed like a small Sunday. Layla's knees buckled under the force of it. "What is happening?" "The light returns," said Neferet. "Each age must remember itself before it fades." The ground beneath them rippled, and the buried temple revealed itself in fragments, great slabs of obsidian rising from the sand, inscriptions gleaming gold in the starlight. The faint outline of the colossal statue appeared once more, her face serene and knowing. Layla felt tears stream down her cheeks. "They erased you from history." "Not erased," Neferet replied. "Transformed. I became the silence between words, the space where truth waits to be remembered. The hum reached a crescendo. It was no longer mere vibration, but music, deep, harmonious, eternal. Each note seemed to awaken something in the earth, in the air, in Layla herself. "Listen," Neferet whispered. "This is the voice of the world before it was divided. This is the breath of the stars." Layla closed her eyes. The sound surrounded her, filled her, dissolved her fear. She saw visions, the river gleaming like gold beneath the sun, temples rising and crumbling, the same woman in every age, remembered by a different name, but always carrying the same truth. When she opened her eyes again, Neferet was fading, her form dissolving into the air. "Tell them I was real," she said softly. "Tell them they are, too." And then the light vanished. The wind returned, warm and alive, sweeping over the valley with a sigh that seemed to carry laughter and mourning all at once. Layla fell to her knees, the sand cool beneath her palms. The hum faded, but she could still feel it, not in the air, but in herself, pulsing through her veins. She looked up at the sky. Sirius shone brighter than ever before, and for the first time in her life, she felt as though the stars were breathing with her. The return of the light had not been an ending, but a reminder. The desert remembered, and now, so did she. When the team found her at dawn, she was sitting silently beside the stones, her face peaceful, her notebook open to a single line written in a steady hand. The word was never lost. It became the world. That night, long after the others slept, Layla dreamed of Neferet's voice, soft, distant, eternal. "As long as one remembers, I am not gone. Verlesment da, and hour, and it caming to life go, and hour, and somewhere, beneath the sand, the temple of the forgotten queen shimmered faintly with its pulse of light, slow, patient, eternal, as the world above turned once more toward the dawn. Echoes beneath the sands." The news of Layla's discovery travelled quickly, as all great mysteries do. Photographs of the exposed foundations appeared in newspapers across Cairo and London, captioned with phrases like "ancient temple unearthed in Thebes desert" and "possible pre-dynastic site found beneath the sands." But what the articles did not show, what they could not show, was the pulse. Instruments recorded inexplicable low-frequency vibrations emanating from the stone, a constant tone that defied geological explanation. The experts called it seismic activity, though the pattern was too perfect, too musical. Some said the resonance matched the oscillation of the Earth's own core. Layla gave no interviews. She withdrew from the excavation soon after the first wave of attention. Her colleagues assumed exhaustion, perhaps trauma from too many nights under the desert sky. Yet those who had been close to her noticed subtle changes: the calm with which she moved, the stillness in her eyes, the faint rhythm of her breath that seemed to align with the pulse of the world itself. She had brought back little from the valley, a notebook filled with sketches, measurements, and one small fragment of obsidian that she kept in her coat pocket. When she held it to her ear, she could still hear the faint hum, like the echo of her own heartbeat. She told no one about Neferet, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because she knew that language could not hold it. Words belonged to time, and what she had heard had come from before time had begun. "Than these 40s be, by arms of not." Months passed. The desert remained restless. Satellite images showed subtle changes in the surface pattern of the sand, as though the dunes themselves had shifted along invisible lines of geometry. Meteorologists reported strange distortions in the local magnetic field, and yet, amid these anomalies, there were no tremors, no eruptions, only the steady hum, faint but constant, emanating from deep beneath the earth. One evening, as Cairo was swallowed in a dust storm, Layla sat by her window and watched the city blur into shades of amber and grey. The wind howled through the alleys, scattering the lights of passing cars into rippling halos. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard it again, that deep, rhythmic tone, blending with the wind's cry. She pressed her palm to the glass, and for a moment, the pain seemed to vibrate beneath her touch. Then she saw it. Not in the city, but beyond, far beyond, across the horizon of her memory, the valley again, bathed in twilight, the temple half buried but alive with faint gold light. The figure of Neferet standing at its entrance, watching the stars. The image flickered like a mirage, then was gone. Layla drew a slow breath. The hum did not fade. It grew stronger, clearer, forming a pattern that resonated in her chest like a second heartbeat. It was not a call, not a command, but an invitation. She knew then that she had to return. It's beef. The find a rougher. It's rougher fife. And the fur. It's beef fur. And one side of this. It's B5. It's beef fur. And aptable de pife. When she arrived in the valley, the desert greeted her with silence. The excavation site was deserted. The government had suspended further digs after the unexplained readings continued to baffle their engineers. The tents were gone, the equipment removed, only the wind remained, sweeping across the dunes in long, low sighs. Layla walked to the place where she had last seen the light. The sand was smooth, unbroken, but when she pressed her hand against it, the vibration answered her, a soft pulse rising from below, slow and alive. "Neferet," she whispered. The hum deepened, the air around her shifting like breath. "You returned." The voice was faint at first, as though carried on the wind, but then it grew, filling the air around her, inside her. Layla's throat tightened. "I couldn't forget. None who hear the word ever truly do." The sand beneath her feet began to tremble, not violently, but with a measured rhythm, like the beating of a drum buried in the heart of the world. Slowly, a circle of light appeared, outlining the shape of the temple far below. The dunes began to sink inward, the sand parting like water drawn toward a whirlpool. Layla stood at the center, unafraid, as the ground opened beneath her. The descent was slow, graceful, as though the desert itself was lowering her into memory. When her feet touched stone, the light was already waiting. The temple stood as it had before, unbroken, unaged, its obsidian pillars gleaming softly. The statue of Neferet towered above the altar, her eyes half closed, her hands outstretched as if welcoming her home. Layla approached slowly, her footsteps echoing like raindrops. "You carry what they could not," Neferet's voice whispered. "The memory of love, hidden even from the gods." Layla's eyes filled with tears. "Why me?" "Because you listened." She reached out, placing her palm on the altar. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly beneath her touch. A glow spread outward, illuminating the carvings that spiraled along the walls, the same patterns of stars, the same intertwined serpents and feathers, now alive with motion. "Do you understand now what they feared?" Neferet asked. "I think so," Layla whispered. "They feared that you had found a way to make heaven and earth the same. They feared a world without masters." The light intensified. The air hummed in harmony with her heartbeat. Every age forgets. It buries truth beneath names, builds walls around memory. But the sand does not forget. It holds every echo, every breath, every step. Layla closed her eyes. She could hear it now, not just one hum, but many. Thousands of voices, whispering through the stone, blending into a single tone. The sound was not mournful but full of music older than speech, woven from every memory the earth had ever held. "This is the voice of the world," Neferet said. "It is not mine alone. I am only its mirror." The temple pulsed once more. The light flared, not blinding, but infinite. For an instant, Layla saw all of time. The first dawn over the Nile, the pharaoh's processions, the fall of empires, the rise of cities, the electric hum of the modern world, all bound by the same rhythm, the same wordless song. Then, gently, it faded. The light sank back into the walls, the carvings dimmed, the hum softened. Layla stood alone once more in the silent temple. But the silence was not empty. It was alive, breathing around her, within her. She looked up at the statue. The faintest smile graced Neferet's stone lips. "The desert remembers," the queen whispered. "Now the world will too." Layla bowed her head. When she rose, the temple was gone, or perhaps it had never been there. She found herself standing once more in the open desert, the stars glittering above, the wind whispering softly across the dunes. She looked down. Beneath her hand, pressed into the sand, was a single feather carved from obsidian, tipped with gold, pointing upward this time. She smiled through her tears. "The silence is over," she said softly. Far to the east, the horizon brightened. Dawn was coming, and from beneath the sands, faint but clear, came the hum of the earth rising, swelling, carrying the forgotten voice of the world into the morning light. It was the same song it had always been, the song of creation, the breath of remembrance, and it would never be silenced again. The word that was not spoken. Long after dawn, the desert glowed with that soft golden haze that seems to blur time itself. Layla stood at the ridge overlooking the valley, the wind carrying ribbons of sand that shimmered like mist. The excavation was gone, no tents, no markers, no trenches. The place had folded itself back into its ancient stillness, as though no human hand had ever disturbed it. Yet beneath her feet, she could still feel the faint pulse, slow, steady, eternal. It was not a sound any more, but a presence. The earth itself breathed in rhythm with her own heart. She thought of the centuries of seekers who had come before her, Wynne, Hollings, Yusuf, drawn by whispers older than civilization. She could almost see them now, their silhouettes lingering at the edge of memory. Wynne, with his trembling notebook, eyes fever-bright. Hollings gazing toward the stars with awe and terror. Yusuf kneeling in the temple's glow, his face lit with understanding. They were all part of the same current, the same remembering. The hum deepened slightly, as if in answer to her thought. "It was never about finding me," the voice came, soft and resonant, threading through the wind. "It was about finding yourselves." Layla closed her eyes. "Neferet," she whispered, "you stand where they stood, and where others will stand again. The word passes not through tongues, but through hearts that can hear it." Layla felt the warmth spread through her chest again, not heat, but an expansion, a vastness that defied language. Around her, the air shimmered faintly, the light bending as though the world itself exhaled. "Tell me," she said softly, "what is the word? What did you speak that shook the heavens?" For a long moment, there was only the hush of the wind. Then, faintly, a sound began. Not a voice, not quite music, but vibration, subtle and pure. It moved through her bones, through the air, through the sand. It was neither high nor low, neither loud nor soft. It simply was, and in that sound, she understood. It was not a word to be spoken. It was the resonance of being the tone of existence itself. The first breath, the echo of creation that still trembles through every atom. She saw it then, not with her eyes, but with the mind that existed behind sight. The temple, the desert, the stars, all vibrating in harmony, each reflecting the other. The universe was not silent, it was singing, softly, eternally. "The priests feared this," Neferet's voice murmured, "for they built their power upon separation, the living from the divine, the gods from the people, truth from silence. But the word undoes all division. It reminds the world that everything is one." Layla sank to her knees, her hands pressing into the sand. The grains were warm, almost alive. "Each age buries me," Neferet continued. "Each age rediscovers me, and in each age one remembers what the word truly is. Not to command, not to create, but simply to be, to live as the echo of the first sound." Layla lifted her head. The horizon shimmered, the morning light spilling over the dunes. "Then what do I do with it? How do I keep it alive?" "You already have," said the voice. "You remembered." For a moment, everything was still. The hum softened into silence, but the silence was alive, rich with meaning. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of myrrh, faint and ancient. When she opened her eyes again, she was alone. No voice, no hum, only the desert, stretching vast and endless beneath the rising Sunday. But it was enough. The word was not gone. It had simply become everything. Layla stood slowly, brushing the sand from her hands. Her shadow stretched long across the dunes, merging with the contours of the earth. She turned toward the horizon and began to walk. With each step, she could feel it, the vibration, faint but constant, echoing in her pulse, her breath, her thoughts. And she realized that Neferet had never died, because Neferet was not a person, but the memory of connection, the eternal truth that all things remember themselves through one another. She smiled as the first wave of wind rose, sweeping around her, carrying the faintest trace of a whisper. "You are the word now, these not for lesting from there." The light caught in her hair, the sands glimmered gold, and for an instant the entire desert seemed to hum low, steady, in harmony with the heartbeat of the world. That evening, when the sun sank and Sirius rose once more, its light fell perfectly along the valley's axis, illuminating a narrow line in the sand where no one had walked for centuries. The stone beneath glowed faintly for a moment, a single breath of light, and then faded again into stillness. Far away, in cities that no longer looked toward the stars, people paused without knowing why. For a moment, every clock ticked in perfect rhythm, every breeze stilled, every living thing took one synchronized breath, and then time resumed. But somewhere deep in the desert, beneath the weight of forgotten centuries, the hum continued slow, eternal, gentle, the pulse of a memory that could never die. For the word had never been lost. It had only waited for someone to listen, and as long as there were hearts that could feel, the silence would never be empty again. The silence after the word. The desert was quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence it had once been. It was fuller now, resonant, a silence that listened. When the wind passed over the dunes, it no longer sighed with loneliness, but carried a subtle, harmonious hum, as though the very air remembered a melody it had once sung at the beginning of the world. Beneath that endless expanse of light and sand, the memory of Neferet Queen, priestess, voice of the first breath lingered like a pulse just below hearing. The world had changed, though no one could say exactly how. Layla's footsteps were the only trace of movement upon the dunes that morning. She had not gone far from the valley, yet she felt she had crossed something greater than distance, a threshold between what is known and what waits to be remembered. Behind her, the sands had closed over the place where the temple once shone. Ahead stretched a horizon so vast it seemed to fold into the sky itself. For a long time she simply stood there, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet that now filled everything. And in that quiet, she began to hear the layers of the world. There was the low vibration of the earth itself, the rhythm of stone and root and time. There was the softer pulse of the wind, the faint hiss of grains sliding against one another. And deeper still, beneath all that, there was something older, vaster, the echo of the word that had never been spoken but lived within every heartbeat. She had not seen Neferet again since that final whisper, but she felt her presence everywhere, in the warmth of the morning sun on her skin, in the slow, steady beat of her own heart, in the stillness between breaths, where the world seemed to pause and remember itself. The queen was not gone. She had dissolved back into the pattern from which all things are woven. Layla walked until the valley disappeared behind her. As the sun climbed higher, the heat shimmered around her like a veil. The dunes seemed to ripple with light, forming shapes that might have been mirages or memories. For an instant, she thought she saw a procession moving across the horizon, figures in linen robes carrying torches, a woman veiled in white at their center. The vision wavered, shimmered, and vanished. Only the wind remained. Yet she knew it was no illusion. The past was never truly gone, it only shifted its shape. When she reached a high ridge, she stopped and turned back one last time. The sand was smooth, unbroken, no sign of the temple, no hint of human presence, only the desert, vast and golden, stretching to eternity. But as she watched, the surface quivered, and faint lines began to appear, drawn by the wind, the outline of a feather, delicate and perfect, pointing upward. She smiled. "The silence remembers," she whispered. The words drifted away, but the air seemed to hold them. As she descended the far side of the dune, she thought of Wynne, Hollings, and Yusuf, of all those who had sought Neferet and found only the reflection of their own longing. Each of them had heard the same call, the same hum beneath the silence, yet each had understood it in his own way. Wynne had sought truth in discovery, Hollings in devotion, Yusuf in redemption. She wondered if perhaps they had not vanished at all, but had become part of the desert's living memory, the quiet chorus that waited for someone new to listen. She felt no fear in that thought, only peace. For the first time in her life, She understood that the end of a story is not silence but continuation. The word that had once shaped the world was not gone. It had only become too vast to speak. When she reached the edge of the plateau, she stopped. The world below shimmered in waves of heat, the Nile a thread of silver winding through the plain. The wind brushed her face gently, carrying the faint scent of water and myrrh. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and then she heard it again, faint, far away, but unmistakable. The hum, not from beneath her feet now, but from everywhere at once, the air, the earth, the sky. It was not loud, but it was infinite. Each vibration folded into another until there was no boundary between sound and silence, between listening and being. The word was never spoken. The memory of Neferet whispered within her. It became all things. It became you. Tears filled Layla's eyes, but she smiled through them. The light of the sun was bright, yet gentle. She opened her hands, feeling the warmth settle into her palms, and in that moment she understood what Neferet had meant. The divine had never been lost, only forgotten, buried beneath the noise of centuries. To remember it was not to worship, but to live in harmony with the breath of creation itself. She turned toward the rising day and began to walk. Her footprints trailed behind her, soon to be erased by the wind, yet she knew the desert would not forget them. Nothing was ever truly lost, not the queen, not her temple, not the voices of those who had listened. They lived now in the rhythm of the world, in the pulse that linked every grain of sand, every star, every heartbeat. When the first travellers found her journals years later, left behind in a small hut near Luxor, they were struck by their calm beauty. The pages were filled not with academic observations, but with slow, looping lines of prose and sketches of stars. At the end of the final book was a single sentence, written in elegant Arabic and English alike. The silence after the word is not absence, it is understanding. And though the world would move on machines humming, cities growing, time pressing ever forward, the echo remained. On nights when Sirius rose clear over the eastern horizon, shepherds still claimed to hear a low song drifting through the dunes, soft and endless. Some said it was the wind, others, the earth. But those who listened closely knew better. It was the desert remembering itself, the murmur of the word that could not be spoken, returning again and again, gentle as breath, patient as eternity. And in that sound, if one listened long enough, one might almost hear a woman's voice, quiet, loving, infinite, whispering across the centuries. I am here. I am always here. The stars shimmered, the sands breathed, and the world, once more, was awake.